Dougal, The Ghosts of Culloden Moor, Book 12. Written by L. Muir. Narrated by Andrew McDermott and Jenn McGuirk. Chapter 1. Mendon Mountain Music Festival. A massive, white designer purse on the shoulder of a bony, crisply dressed woman paused in front of Hannah's booth. The woman's fingernails were candy apple red and matched the patterned scarf around her wide-brimmed hat. She could just picture those nails, drumming on the arm of an expensive chair while servants ran back and forth, doing everything the woman could have done for herself if it weren't for her manicure. The woman tilted her head back to look down her nose at Witch's Mist, one of Hannah's most recent and eye-catching paintings, perched on a large table easel at the front of the booth. Happily, the colours brought people in for a closer look, but it happened to be one of her personal favourites, so much so she was tempted to throw a sheet over it. Red nails didn't deserve to look at it.
Interesting.
She glanced around and did a double-take when she noticed Hannah sitting in the corner, like she didn't expect anyone to be guarding the artwork. She quickly hid her interest and adopted a horribly bored attitude. Pointing in the vague direction of Witch's Mist, she deigned to say 2 words.
How much?
Since Hannah had no intention of allowing one of her children to leave with an obvious child-eater, she tripled the price.
6,600.
The woman gaped.
6,600? Yes.
Hannah smiled her most patronizing smile that said,
Don't worry about it, honey, if you don't have that kind of money.
Then she bent her head back to the sketchpad and ignored her. It was a long minute before Red Nails went on her way. Hannah's neck got a kink from bending far enough to hide behind her dangling hair, so when the woman was gone, she put her shoulders back and rolled her head around on her shoulders to get rid of the twinge. "I would swear to it," came a man's voice from behind, "that you gave another woman a different price a wee while ago." Hannah watched in shock as a guy in a rumpled Scottish kilt walked through her booth and made his way around the table to look at Witch's Mist. Since the town of Mendon had been settled by Scots, his wasn't the first kilt she'd seen that weekend, so it wasn't the way he dressed that surprised her. She was bothered by the way he'd ignored the whole behind-the-counter protocol she expected, even if her business was only a 10x10 canopy tent. For the weekend of the festival, that 100 square feet belonged to her, and anything behind the table was a customer-free zone. Anyone who had ever attended an art festival or a county fair knew that, except one tall Scot, apparently. She felt exposed, like she'd used the bathroom with the door open, only to find there had been people in the hallway. The night before, she'd slept with her children, making a blanket fort with the table because she'd been so certain no one would invade that space. It was against the rules to camp in the booths, but if she'd gotten wasted like half the vendors and fallen asleep behind their tables, no one would have said a word. And she was prepared to use that argument if anyone tried to penalise her. Leaving her artwork alone in the after-hours chaos was something she simply couldn't do. And she certainly wasn't going to lug them back and forth across the field each night and morning. The frames were expensive, and every time they were moved, they risked damage. She folded her arms and narrowed her eyes at the intruder, even though he'd moved out of her private space. She just wanted to make sure he didn't intend to go back the way he'd come. He was in his late 20s or early 30s, nicely built. He wasn't what she would call cute, not really handsome either, but striking. His features looked a little old-world, or at least not local. Above his short, close beard, his nose was crooked, like he'd been in a lot of fights, but his cheeks were smooth and tan, his arms a little hairy. The sides of his head were shaved, and the longer hair in the middle created a mohawk, but much of it fell down in a line, like he'd run out of hair product, and without it, his hair looked more like a thick, mussed horse's tail trailing down his head and neck. His eyes were electric green, and they darted back and forth while he took in every little detail of the painting, but this time she didn't feel like hiding it.
You a vendor?
That might explain his backdoor entrance. His mouth twisted to the side, and he shook his head, which shook his strange mohawk, but he never took his eyes off the painting. Not a vendor.
A musician?
He definitely looked like a musician from one of those Celtic tribal bands that had played late the night before. The noise had proved too much for her, and though she usually didn't take over-the-counter drugs if she could help it, she jumped at the Tylenol offered by the guy selling corn dogs across the way. Again, the Scot shook his head and his hair, and the little frown between his brows let her know he didn't like being interrupted while he was studying her work. "Which is missed," he whispered, then glanced at her. "Aptly named, I should say, though the only bit of it I've seen was green, not this." He gestured toward the canvas of blue and black. "Sea blue, is it?"
Nile blue,
she corrected, then wondered what the colour had to do with anything. The guy said he'd seen green mist before, probably soon after sampling a new strain of weed, and she was worried he'd gotten the colour wrong. What could it matter? She bit her lip and waited for what other observations he might make. He was probably just killing time until the lines died down at either of the paraphernalia booths beside her. "I suppose this is your witch?" He nodded toward the upper left corner.
How did you know?
No one ever knew there was a witch in the painting, let alone guessed where it was. However, when setting up her booth the day before, she'd pointed out the witch to another vendor.
You must have heard me explaining it yesterday.
He shook his head again. "Just arrived a wee while ago, lass. I guessed where your witch might be, only because mine happens to wear a fine black robe when she summons her green mist to her."
Don't engage. Do not engage.
Her artist friends were right. She shouldn't allow herself to be sucked into someone else's psychosis.
Time to smile and nod and hope he wanders off.
But he didn't. Finally, he stepped away from the table and glanced around at the other paintings she'd propped on chairs along the sides of the booth, and a tall ladder she used as an easel for smaller paintings. A little one caught his attention, which was typical. Most people who wanted to patronize an artist will look for the smallest one and hope they can afford it. "Tell me," he said without looking at her, "why did you quote the 2 different prices to 2 different customers? I'd like to understand." He was now within 3 feet of her and getting awfully close to being behind the counter again. She didn't see anything wrong with telling him the truth.
I didn't want the second woman to buy it.
But that was only half true, since she really didn't want anyone to buy it. He looked at her then, studying her face, just like he'd studied both the paintings, and she suddenly didn't want to know his opinion on what he saw there in her eyes. "And how much for this wee oil chair?" Oil chair was the name of her smallest painting, but the nameplate had fallen off the whitewashed frame. The guy was just a good guesser, that was all.
600.
600? He chuckled, and she braced herself for an insult. "And tell me, lass, is it 600 because you wish me to buy it, or because you hope I'll be dissuaded?"
So you'll buy it?
She lied. The subject of oil chair had sat upon her grandmother's porch for all Hannah's life, but soon after she'd painted it, and while she was sitting at yet another booth, her idiot cousin had taken the chair apart and used the pieces for her stupid craft project.
The old white paint had been chipped off it.
the cousin had argued.
And it probably had lead in it anyway.
Lead or no lead, the chair had belonged on that porch. And after Hannah had inherited the house, coming home had always been bittersweet without that chair to welcome her. Bittersweet, just for a second or two, even if she'd only gone to the store. Parting with the painting would be impossible. She'd known it even as she added it to the box of things to bring to the music festival. And the way the guy was eyeing it, she wished she would have said 6,000 instead. "I'm certain it's worth every penny," he said, and propped it back on the ladder. "What a penny I've not." She sighed in relief, a little too loudly. He laughed, and she didn't know if it was the depth of her relief or the sound of his voice, but she was completely charmed, or maybe it was some kind of witch's mist that made her react that way, because she had no intention of being charmed. "I'm interested to know how ye arrive at your prices, if you don't mind telling." He lowered his chin and gave her a knowing look. "Your original prices, aye." She relaxed a little as he backed away from the painting and returned to the front of the booth.
According to how much of my soul goes into them, I guess.
For a second, there was a sparkle in his eyes that made her think he'd been a little charmed himself. Then understanding dawned like a bowling ball dropped on her head.
You're an artist.
Chapter 2. The tall Scot grinned, and her knees totally wobbled, even though she was sitting. His teeth were straight and white, and in the shade of her canopy they glowed against the tan of his face. "Some have called me an artist from time to time, and I'll take it as a great compliment, even though you've never seen the way I turn a leg." She glanced down at his high socks.
Turn a leg? I don't understand.
He chuckled. "A table leg, aye. Carpenters like myself turned them by hand back when God's dog was a pup." The image made her smile. There were a lot of old Scottish families in Liberty, too, where her old house stood, and she was enjoying getting to know some of them. The older folks had fascinating ways of saying things, too, but she'd never heard that kind of stuff from guys her own age before. He stepped close to Witch's Mist and zoned out again. This time, she was happy to let him look his fill, partly because he was some kind of artist himself, and partly because she knew he wouldn't try to buy it. The large designer bag started making its way back along the far side of the wide, grassy aisle. It was a wonder Red Nails didn't trip and fall with her head tipped back so far. Hannah also wondered how that hat stayed on the back of her head. The scarf had to be cutting off circulation to her brain or something. The hat swivelled in her direction and came to a halt. The woman's attention caught on the Scottish guy. Then she noticed what he was staring at, and her eyes tried to pop out of her head. Hannah's stomach fell. She knew she was in trouble. In 3 long strides, the woman made it across traffic to stand rudely close to the Scot.
I'll take it,
she announced, then lifted her purse and reached into the wide opening with a delicate claw.
I can give you a deposit now and have my driver get a cashier's check for the rest.
Hannah couldn't think, couldn't speak. Her fingers curled in anticipation of having that much money handed to her at once, but inside her chest a voice screamed.
No, don't let her take it. Somebody stop her.
But in the left side of her brain, another part of her was using an old-fashioned calculator to tally up her bills. Punch, 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 pull the handle down, enter the back taxes, grind the handle down again. "I regret to inform ye, madam, but I've just purchased Witch's Mist myself." The Scot put his back to the painting like he was willing to protect it with his body. Inside Hannah's chest, the loud, obnoxious cheerleader lost her mind, whooping and screaming, relieved someone had rescued her child. The accountant in her started weeping and tossed the massive old calculator out a window. Red Nails ignored the guy.
I'll give you 1,000 more.
The way she looked Hannah over from head to toe said she suspected $1,000 would be life-changing for her, let alone the 6,600 she'd quoted.
Come now, I'm sure all you get is a commission, so the extra 1,000 would be all yours.
That extra 1,000 would have made it impossible to refuse if the woman hadn't insulted her along with the offer. The Scot's face darkened. "'Tisn't for sale, madam." The woman's nose curled on one side.
Really? Let me see your receipt.
He gestured toward Hannah. "The lass ran my card through her wee phone, not that it's your concern." The woman folded her arms and leaned back on one hip.
All right then. Go ahead and take it if it's yours.
Hannah's mouth was finally operational.
I appreciate what you tried to do,
she told her would-be rescuer. To the woman, she said,
"You can't have it."
Red Nails rolled her eyes.
Did you hear me? I'm willing to pay your price.
She started digging again and produced a small wallet that matched the purse.
Doesn't matter,
Hannah said, feeling bolder by the second.
Thank you for the offer, but I can't possibly part with it.
The woman frowned and stared. The wallet, that probably cost thousands of dollars on its own, hovered in the air, while she waited for someone reasonable to explain. Hannah usually made it a point to be kind, even in tense situations, but she still felt like a mama bear protecting her cub. The panic sent her manners out the window, along with that old calculator, and the woman was still waiting for a more rational explanation. So Hannah explained.
You can't have it, ma'am, because my paintings are my children, and I have a feeling that you eat children for breakfast. There. At least that was nicer than coming right out and calling her a child eater, right?
Hannah smiled brightly, pleased she'd pulled back a little at the end. It was better than nothing. Red Nails gasped so sharply she could have swallowed her teeth if they'd been loose. After the Scottish dude got his eyes back in his head and took a breath, he exploded with laughter. He had to bend and put his hands on his knees to catch his breath, but every time he did, he just started laughing again. People stared, then stopped walking altogether when they noticed how he was dressed. A big knot formed in the crowd, and Red Nails slipped a pair of sunglasses on and fought her way back into the festival throng to separate herself from the spectacle.
You can stop now. She's gone.
"Children for breakfast," he repeated.
Oh no, don't start. You'll lure real customers over here and I'll have to lie again.
He finally wound down. "So, you don't wish to sell any of them?" She shook her head and tears filled her eyes, knowing just what she would be giving up instead. "So, you'll be packing up and going, I presume?"
Nope, can't do that either. The rules say I have to stay until the end. They don't want anyone tearing down until the official event ends, so I'll have to just turn people away.
"Well, we'll both be unpopular then. I don't suppose the woman is happy with either of us."
No. I'm sure she's marching off to find the guy who runs this place to make sure I'm not allowed back again.
He gave her a funny look. "But, lass, do you truly wish to come back? That is, if you cannot part with the children." She looked around at the display. Scenes from her life looked back. A silly night at college when she'd painted 6 feet standing together, one of each. The image forced you to imagine the people attached to those feet and worry about where the other feet were, every time. It was a joke in paint. And the rest of her pieces were the same, containing inside jokes or sentiments that only she could truly appreciate.
You're right. I should stop torturing myself.
Which meant she would be choosing another kind of torture, losing her house. Unfortunately, even knowing that, she still couldn't part with them. The admission brought tears to her eyes and pushed them out onto her cheeks. "Here now, lassie, dinna greet." She shook her head and ignored him, indulging for the first time in what would probably be a year of mourning.
What good is the house without the old chair, anyway?
"What's that, lass?" She forced the tears back and briefly explained that she needed to sell some of her paintings in order to pay taxes.
So if I was smart, I'd chase that woman down and offer the painting for the original price.
The guy shook his head and rustled his mohawk. "Nay, miss, her type only wants it if it's expensive, and only if someone else wants it. She'd hang it on a wall and never look at it again. The painting would die from a lack of attention." She was completely caught off guard by his grasp of the situation, and it was such a relief to be understood she could only nod. Silence stretched out between them. The crowd had lost interest, except for a few women who couldn't take their eyes off the guy's knees. Even so, it seemed like the two of them were suddenly alone in a bubble. He jumped, like he just remembered something, and stepped forward with his hand extended. "Dougal Cameron, at your service." She extended her hand too, but he grabbed it, turned it, and kissed the back of it before she could think to stop him. His lips were warm, and the kiss was tender, but it was just too creepy, even if it was some kind of Scottish chivalry thing. Chivalry was dead, and best left to video games.
Well, thanks again.
She pulled her hand back. He frowned. "You dinna wish to give me your name?"
Oh, sorry. My name is Hannah. Hannah Gar.
"Lovely." After a few seconds of awkward silence, he winked and turned away, bypassed the next booth and got lost in the crowd. She was relieved, she told herself, over and over again. Chapter 3. By weaving in and out of the strange crowd of music enthusiasts, Dougal hoped to elude his own witch for the moment. Little more than an hour ago, he'd been praying for his noble deed to present itself, so he could move on to his meeting with Charles Stewart. He was anxious to vent his spleen, as it were, and anxious to let a bit of the prince's blood as well, through the nose and mouth, and in that order. But quick as the flash of a lass's smile, the urgency was gone. It surprised him that a brief encounter with Miss Hannah could so quickly ease his thirst for revenge. The thirst was still there, of course, but the slaking of it could wait a piece. After all, he'd not been mortal for long, and he'd yet to enjoy himself. A thorough perusal of his sporran, however, proved he not a coin to his name, so enjoying his mortal senses might prove difficult. The smells in the air were free for the tasting, thank the heavens, and he greedily gulped up the savoury scent of cooking meat. Unfortunately, it made his belly groan. A fog of pipe smoke caught him next, though it tasted of nothing familiar. As soon as that was out of his nose, the sweet tang of summer grasses cleansed his palate. But it also invited the memories of Culloden Moor along, and the shadow of the battle threatened to descend over him like a cloud. He shook his head to dispel any unpleasantness, and crashed into a pair of lasses. They too had a lovely, clean smell to them, and it cheered him instantly. "A beg pardon," he said, retreated, and made to go around them. But they moved into his path again, suggesting he hadn't been to blame for the first misstep.
Would you mind?
Asked the one, then held up her cellular phone. "What is it I might mind, lass?" She giggled and nudged her friend, who seemed to have difficulty making sound come out of her mouth, no matter how she tried. Her lips opened and closed silently.
Can we, take a picture with you?
Asked the first. He considered. At the moment he seemed solid enough, so it stood to reason his image would appear in a photograph.
$20?
The lass added, as if she worried he would refuse her. Though a gentleman would decline the offer of money for so paltry a service, the smell of meat wafted past his nose again, and he took it as a sign from the heavens that he should accept. "That'll do fine," he said, and opened his arms. The lass gave her phone over to an older woman, and she and her friend tucked themselves up snug against him. Dougal gave a wide smile to the woman holding the phone, and after the first lass checked the image, she handed over a $20 bill as easily as a penny. Looking somewhat uncomfortable, the woman who had taken the photo stepped close.
Would you mind one more?
She gestured for her husband to come nearer and handed the confused man a camera from her purse. The man looked closely at Dougal's kilt, rolled his eyes, then stepped back to aim the camera. His wife held on tight for possibly longer than was necessary, and indeed dawdled so long while thanking Dougal, her husband saw fit to step forward and pull her away. Dougal looked down at the 2 matching bills in his hand, tucked them into his sporran, then turned to follow the smell of food. His stomach had to wait for another 6 photographs, however, before he could slip away. Until he was able to eat his fill, he was careful not to make eye contact with anyone, just in case. He was flattered, truly, but he'd been witness to many a similar occurrence on the battlefield, only the men accosted for pictures were the wearers of modern-day kilts and usually sported a set of Highland pipes, but few of them were paid for their smiles. He was enjoying the shade and privacy provided by a low-hanging branch and the coolness of a large plastic glassful of ginger beer when he heard a familiar voice. The child-eater was berating a man. The only things clearly visible below the leaves were the man's shorts and sandals.
Don't you have any control here at all?
The child-eater demanded. "Look," the man said, "I'm sorry she won't sell it to you, but we don't have a lot of rules here, you know?"
Don't you get a percentage of her sales or something?
The man chuckled. "No, ma'am. This is a music festival. We're just trying to bring the music to the people and the people to the music. That's it. The booths are just, for fun." There was a long, silent pause before the fellow made his excuses and hurried away.
John, you're just going to have to buy it for me, that's all. There are no banks open. I'll have to go home to get the cash. I need you to stay here and make sure no one else buys that painting. And if you see a man in a blue kilt, make sure he doesn't take off with anything large. I'll call you when I'm back.
Dougal went the long way round the shrubbery. He noted the child-eater walking toward the road where all the cars were parked. Unfortunately, he had no idea who John might be. Chapter 4. The music festival was an affair that unfolded in the opposite direction of most outdoor events around the state. At the Scottish festival, Peach Days or Swiss Days, the crowd always hit the booths first, searching frantically for the latest craze before that craze was sold out. And then, later in the day, most people were interested in food and socializing. At the music festival, the crowd was there for the entertainment first and foremost, and when the hunger for music and food was satisfied, they started looking around for other entertainment and finally noticed there were rows of vendors waiting for them. The older crowd would be gone by 7. Hopefully Red Nails had a dinner party to host, so Hannah's heart could stop jumping every time she saw a white purse. The afternoon was a bummer all round. Few took notice of her booth, but then again, she never had to ask herself if she really wanted to part with something, and after a lot of quiet time to think about her lovely Victorian, she was right back where she started, not knowing what she really wanted. If she had to decide between the paintings and the house, it was silly to choose the paintings, but still. It was like trying to choose between her heart and her soul. What cruel god would make that kind of a choice necessary? Around 6 o'clock, she drew 2 caricatures for a couple of teenagers who wanted to document their first date with something besides a selfie. And since $40 wasn't enough to make a dent in anything but her hunger, she walked across the flattened grass and ordered a corn dog and a drink. Better to fatten up if she was going to be living on the street anyway, right? Back at her station, she had just finished the last of her corn dog, which, by the way, she would never eat in public again, thanks to some lewd glances, when the Scottish dude came rushing back. He tossed a $20 bill on the table. "Quick, lass, sign a receipt for Witch's Mist, and hurry. The child eater plans to have her henchman purchase the painting, and I've no ken what the man looks like. If ye truly wish for Witch's Mist to remain yours, you must do what I say, but you must decide, and quickly." With shaking hands, she took out the book of receipts that got very little use. Very little use. Why hadn't she realized it before? She could have saved herself a little gas and a lot of heartache if she'd never pretended she could part with a single canvas. The choice between her heart and soul had been made long ago. She just hadn't realized it.
$20, Witch's Mist, Dougal Cameron.
She ripped the white copy out of the book and handed it over. The act of doing so did something crazy to her insides. She was both nauseated and relieved, and she didn't have a second to figure out why. The Celtic tribal band started up again, which meant no one would be speaking, let alone thinking in peace for a little while. "Thank you, lass. I'll protect it with my life." He put his hand over his heart, bowed, then scooped up the painting and hurried away. She hadn't expected him to take it.
Wait!
Her voice was lost in the skirl of pipes and the manic beat of drums as the band paraded down the aisle between herself and the corn dogs. The dancing, whooping audience swallowed the Scot and her painting before she ever made it out of her booth, and with the chaos growing, she couldn't even consider leaving her other children unprotected. The bare-boned truth was this: nothing was more boring than manning a booth. It takes vigilance and work to smile at every passer-by. It's exhausting to pretend to be both physically and mentally present for 2 days straight. Hannah was happy to learn that the vendors could strike their booths at 10 p.m. that night, since there would be no business done on Sunday. She'd forgotten the only thing on the schedule for the next morning was a yoga sun-greeting meditation something that was planned for the ungodly hour of 7 a.m., and she certainly wasn't going to hide under a table all night just to attend. If she could get everything packed up by 10:30, she could make it home by midnight. She just hoped Dougal Cameron wasn't planning to keep Witch's Mist until morning, or longer. Now that she thought about it, the guy had a receipt to prove he'd bought the painting. He could just drive off with it. Had he been conning her all along, trying to think of a way to get the painting for just $20? The first time he'd shown up, he said he didn't have a penny, then he'd handed over $20. What's up with that? It made her sick to distrust him, but she was notorious for being too trusting. Had she screwed up again, or was she overcorrecting now? She was going to lose her mind, but who could blame her? One of her children was missing, and all she could do was wait and pray. Across the way, Hannah noticed a tall guy in a suit waiting for a corn dog. Although most people could appreciate a state fair, oversized, dipped in real corn batter corn dog, the suit was definitely out of place. Was he stopping off after work? She was pretty sure that in Mendon only the funeral directors wore suits to work, and this guy definitely didn't look like the mortuary type. He looked more like a thug with his sunglasses on in spite of the late afternoon. He lifted his glasses and scanned her side of the aisle, and when his gaze caught on her boot a little longer than the rest, she realized who he had to be. Rednail's driver, or as the Scot called him, her henchman. And if Dougal Cameron was telling the truth, the man would come over and look for Witch's Mist. Maybe he just wanted lunch first. In the meantime, 6 different women stopped and looked over her paintings, but each time they asked the price of something, she had to confess they were no longer for sale. When the 6th woman had a hard time understanding, Hannah had to lie and tell her that someone had purchased the entire collection. It was the only way to get her to leave. She kept tabs on the thug in the suit while she sketched and scared away customers. He finished his food and still didn't come. He wandered down the row, but when he came back, he kept to the far side. The waiting drove her crazy. Why didn't he just come over already? What was he waiting for? He couldn't possibly know the painting was gone without coming up to her table and looking around. Or had he been watching when Dougal carried it away? Did he expect him to return it? It creeped her out to think the man might know what was going on. It made her feel like eyes were watching her, eyes she couldn't see. The sensation wasn't new to her, since she had a real-life stalker at home, but it made her feel helpless, and she hated to feel helpless. She dropped her pencil and forgot all about her sketch when a horrible realization consumed her. It meant Rednails and her goon might get their hands on any one of her other children, and with no fuss at all. Hannah had to pee. Chapter 5. The portable toilets were at the top of the long gravel drive and out of sight. No way could Hannah watch the booth as she walked away, pee quickly, then run back. She was either doomed to pee her pants, or she would have to find someone trustworthy to man the booth for her, and it would have to be someone who could stand up to the bullying of Rednails and her driver. She was doomed. To buy time, she tried to think of something else. Once again, she wondered if the Scot had lied to her. It would certainly make more sense than some woman obsessing about her painting just because she couldn't have it. After all, the painting wasn't so extraordinary. Hannah wondered what he would do with it. Keep it? Sell it on eBay? Con someone else into thinking it was worth much more than it was? Whoa, he had played her so well. All that crap about the only Witch's Mist he'd ever seen had been green. It simply had to be a coincidence that she'd seen green mist too, but only in a dream she'd had. It was the same dream that had inspired the painting, but she knew she'd have better luck selling it if she made the mist Nile blue. Why wasn't she more upset? She'd been robbed, probably. One of her favourite children was gone. Other than a full bladder, what was wrong with her? Was it just the lingering effects of his flattery making her stupid? The vendors to either side of her were far too busy to watch her stuff, like they'd been able to do for her a few times since they'd set up shop the day before. With a steady line of customers, they never had time to glance her way, let alone make eye contact. She had to find someone else. Her bladder expanded by increments while she watched the crowd file past. She needed a loner, or maybe a couple of girls who could at least entertain each other. With her hopes set on girls, She didn't notice the guy with the mohawk until he was 5 feet away. She tried to appear calm for the benefit of the suit across the way. After all, she still didn't know where the biggest threat might come from. For all she knew, there was no threat.
You're back. Don't look now, but I think we're being watched.
Oh, are we now? He grinned at her. I pray it is the only reason you're not so happy to see me. She nodded. She was happy to see that he hadn't taken the painting and left town, but he had returned empty-handed. She was also glad for a chance to see his face again, in case she ever decided to paint it. But that was all. She just needed to memorize a few details and she'd be good. Kilted Conman sounded like a good title.
Where's your kilt? I mean, I would have liked to see it one more time, so I could draw it maybe.
He had little lines around his flashing green eyes when he smiled. So you've missed me, then? She forced herself to laugh. His eyebrows bounced. I'm in disguise, lass. It seems women in these parts appreciate the chance to have their photos taken with a man wrapped in plaid, so I must say I've made a pretty penny this day. I also worried that child eater's henchman might be on the lookout for a Scottish accomplice, so I bought some street clothes from a bloke who has a shelter pitched in yon field. I can retrieve my kilt and your painting when the evil woman is gone. Witch's Mist was in a tent? Great. There were only 50 places she had to search. I noticed some women stopping by. Have you decided you can bear to part with a painting or two after all?
No, I haven't changed my mind. But we can't bring cars in here and load up until after 10 o'clock tonight. I have to keep pretending until then.
He glanced over his shoulder. Look, I must away, lass. Dinna fret. I'll think of something. He'd been gone only 5 seconds when she remembered she still needed to pay. Running a business in a tent was similar to waiting in line all night for concert tickets. In the beginning, the optimism stage, vendors smile and nod at each other while they set up their spaces. After the excitement begins to ebb and the crowds don't arrive promptly when the coordinators promised they would, vendors begin looking to each other to keep up their spirits. First, they take turns playing the role of interested shopper, scanning the products in the booths near their own. For a while, they can all pretend at least someone is interested in their products, and they are then content to wait for the real shoppers to come along. Then comes the false hope stage. A little spurt of foot traffic, a small mob. Wonder of wonders, they stop and browse. You ask a friendly question.
How are you? What's up? How's it going?
You pretend you haven't come all this way, done all this setup just for them because, hey, all desperation stinks and nobody wants to smell that. Then those shoppers confess they are vendors from up the way a bit and give you a sales pitch for whatever they're selling. This launches you into the disgusted stage. There's no skipping over this stage unless you are really talented in the delusion department. Next is the cruel hope stage. Just when you start worrying that you've wasted the booth rental fee, someone pops over to your table and buys something. It's a magical moment. The moment you've imagined happening 1,000 times, with 1,000 eager customers intent on cleaning you out and leaving you with nothing to take home again, except a dirty tablecloth and a bag of money. But even those miracles have to start with a first purchase, and by golly, you've just had it.
Let the mobs come,
You say.
I can handle it. I'm all warmed up. Why, yes, I do have change for 100. Bring it on.
But the flood of foot traffic you've envisioned comes in mobs of teenagers looking for bright, shiny, remote-controlled toys covered in glitter. They are not looking for the clever but understated product you've spent the winter putting together or spent your bonus money purchasing. After that, the grateful for anything stage. You're grateful, profoundly grateful, When anyone at all looks your way, you smile but try to keep your desperation in check, hoping the smell of burnt caramel corn and the no biggie expression you've been practicing will help cover the truth. You answer questions and offer a fun little tidbit for free, maybe a sample, a clever little brochure, and all the while pretending that you won't be devastated if they walk away empty-handed. Finally, mercifully, it's afternoon. But the heat is not so merciful, and the crowds go looking for food and cool drinks with funky straws and silly names. They'd come look at your booth, brimming with product, if only you weren't directly in the sun. Instead, they go wander through the booths beneath the trees, where the Tupperware lady can't really be surprised she hasn't sold anything yet. And you pretend your neck and the tip of your nose aren't on fire. You break out a paper fan, slap on a hat, and retreat into the shadows at the back of your tent, and you decide it doesn't matter. If this festival is a wash, you just won't come back again. You'll stick it out, and if you sell something, you sell something, and if you don't, you don't. You have now slipped into the stage with a title too rude to repeat in public. The screw-it stage, let's say. It is at this point that every vendor has finally let go of their big dreams of selling out, and they're ready to do whatever it takes to make this torture pass quickly. But this is also the best stage of the day because everyone lightens up. You joke around with the neighbours who have also given up, and together you shake your heads and pity the chick down the way who is getting every exposed inch of the flesh sunburned because she's going to hand-sell her product line no matter how small the crowd turned out to be. And hey, did she forget to mention they're all half price? And when customers aren't listening, she vows to the other vendors that she will kill herself before she packs that crap into her van again. Or maybe she's the other type of vendor for whom it is impossible to give up hope. They're the ones who really get their hearts broken when the final hour of the weekend comes and they realize they've been imagining a fantasy that hasn't happened for anyone, except for that hard seller with the shoulder massager and the two kids cleaning up with their remote-controlled, glitter-covered toy that every kid can almost afford. One year, it was a guy who made catapults out of paint stir sticks, a couple of clips and a milk jug lid. The ammo was your everyday ping-pong ball. Yeah, anyone could have made them, but why would you go to the trouble when this guy was selling them so cheap? $5 that saved you from going to the paint store was $5 well spent. That year, when it came time to strike the tents and pack the vehicles with leftover product, the field was covered in smashed ping-pong balls and half a dozen broken paint stir sticks. Of course, Mr. Catapult sold out. In fact, he was sitting at the back of his booth, slapping those suckers together as fast as he could, so those poor kiddies wouldn't be disappointed. Yeah, he'd been a saint, but he'd also been living the dream, and the rest of the vendors hated his guts. But the most important part about the screw-it stage was that no one was busy, and there were plenty of new friends willing and able to watch your booth for you when you needed to go to the portable plastic restrooms out by the road. Hannah's neighbours were having a catapult weekend. They had their side walls in place to discourage shoplifters, and the space behind her had been empty from the start because some vendor was a no-show. The corn dog guy was finally doing some business, and the aisle between their spaces was far too wide for him to watch her stuff anyway. And so, like many times in her life when she'd preferred to go it alone, she was screwed, and her bladder told her she was getting screweder by the second. Why in the heck had she bought the large drink with her corn dog? What went in had to come out no matter how hot the sun was, and an entire Mountain Dew wasn't going to leak out of her sweat glands, and even if it could, she was pretty sure her sweat would be yellow. Ooh. She was going to pee her pants, only she wasn't in pants. She was wearing a summer dress. The grass under her table looked thirsty.
What if I knelt down by the table? No one would know what I was doing. But what if a little yellow stream leaked out from under the front edge of the long tablecloth,
Her rational mind thought that would be better than peeing down her legs. Her bladder agreed.
Do it. Do it.
Her chest tightened. She just couldn't. She'd let her bladder explode first, and even as she thought it, her bladder inflated a little more. She closed her eyes and prayed for a miracle. "Excuse me." A young guy with no shirt and a mass of dreadlocks stood at her table. "You Hannah?" She nodded and blushed, imagining just what she might have been doing behind that table at that very moment if she hadn't come to her senses. "That Scottish dude asked me to come help you."
Really?
That was the quickest answer to prayer she'd ever heard of.
You know what I really need?
She scooted around the edge of the table and into the lane.
I need to go to the bathroom. Can you watch my booth?
"You betcha." He scooted back the way she'd come and folded his arms like he was prepared to defend the place, which he might need to do.
Just don't sell anything while I'm gone, okay?
He nodded. "Got it. Your friend explained what was going on."
Perfect. Thank you.
She started running. Her friend. Well, even if he'd meant to steal her painting, he'd just earned absolution. Chapter 6. The gravel crunched under her shoes as she headed up the drive. She promised her bladder that, if it would just hang on a couple more minutes, she would never drink another drop so long as she lived. She ran into a line as she rounded the last corner. Only the line wasn't for some lucky vendor. It was a line for the bathrooms. A long line, and most of the people standing in it were women. It made sense, though, when she considered that guys could just head into the trees at the far edge of the field and relieve themselves any time they needed to. It was a rural place, after all, not a city. Glorified camping on some guy's property. Power lines tapped into the barn. Problem was, girls took twice as long to pee as boys did. She eyed the line of trees, tried to guess how long it would take to reach them, and imagined how many people standing in that line would know exactly why she'd be headed that way. The chick in front of her took 3 quick steps forward. The line was moving at least. There were at least 2 dozen portables. It shouldn't take any longer to wait for one than it would to get across the field, so she decided to save her dignity and stay. She relaxed a little, and the urgency eased. It was a good thing that kid had come along when he had. A few more minutes and she would have had to leave her artwork unattended. With the henchman watching, she knew she would have returned to find an empty spot or two. Who knows which paintings would have been taken? Now, she hoped her emergency security guard wouldn't get tricked into selling one. Maybe that thug in a suit had just been waiting for her to leave so he could move in and do his mistress's bidding. And if Red Nails was as obsessed as Dougal thought, she might send anyone at all to buy the painting. Some little old lady, maybe. Someone sweet who didn't look like a child-eater at all. Any of those people who had asked about prices could have been sent by her, now that she thought about it. She was so glad she'd made her decision and stuck to it. Inside her head, the wicked angel in her started celebrating and rubbing her hands together, wondering which wall would be best for which painting. She'd always kept her work in the studio to keep from getting too attached, but she no longer needed to pretend. Her children could come home. She knew just where she'd hang Witch's Mist. The accountant angel tapped her on the shoulder and reminded her about that little choice she'd made. It wouldn't matter that she was keeping the paintings. She would soon be giving up the walls she meant to hang them on. Another 3 portables opened up. The line jumped forward.
Not long now. Hang on. Just hang on.
Another few minutes, and she could hurry back to her booth and start packing up. No more pretending, not even for the event coordinator. She'd relax, read a book, and lord over her boxes and frames like a hoarder until 10 o'clock. She could just imagine how disappointed Red Nails would be when all her little spies returned empty-handed. An old lady, a guy in a suit, some girl musician, some kid in dreads and no shirt. Her chest hurt. She forced herself to stop thinking.
Nope. Don't even.
Her bladder reminded her she shouldn't be jumping to conclusions, or jumping anywhere until she got inside one of those blessed plastic rooms. So she stood as still as she could and counted her blessings that she'd thought to wear the dress that morning. Thanks to the light, fluffy layers that went nearly to her feet, it wasn't blatantly obvious that she was crossing her legs. Another 2 steps forward. One person in front of her, only one. No reason to suspect the kid of working for Red Nails. She probably wasn't the type who would speak to anyone shirtless, unless she was smarter than Hannah gave her credit for. But he'd said Dougal had sent him, and Red Nails didn't know Dougal's name. No, not Dougal. He'd called himself the Scottish Dude. Dougal was pretty clever himself. He'd been smart enough to change clothes, to hide the painting. She was finally at the head of the line. There was no more pretending she wasn't desperate. She scanned the grey doors, waiting for one to open. There, to the left. She hurried over and climbed inside, tried not to imagine the germs, and covered the seat with toilet paper. A few blessed seconds later, her bladder forgave her. She could finally think clearly. It didn't matter if the kid had been sent by Red Nails, she thought, while she scrubbed her hands and rinsed them in the clever plastic sink, with water warmed by the sun. Even if Hannah had been suckered into leaving her booth, Witch's Mist wasn't there for anyone to steal. Besides, the woman had plenty of money. She wouldn't want to be accused of a crime. A public theft charge would do more damage to her pride than someone calling her a child-eater, right? No matter how cool Hannah tried to act as she returned to her row, she couldn't make herself walk at a normal pace. In fact, she was walking so fast, she passed her own booth. When she reached the electric massager guy, she looked across the way and realized the corn dog stand was 4 lengths back, which meant her booth was the same. She turned and headed back against the flow of traffic. The first weed lover's booth, an empty space with a cloth-covered table in the middle of it. The second weed lover's booth. Where was her tent? She looked at the empty table again and down at the grass in front of her. The little thirsty-looking patch was there, still looking thirsty. No shirtless guy, no paintings, no canopy. They'd even taken her tent.
This can't be happening. It just can't.
She couldn't breathe. Absently, she wondered if her heart might have stopped beating. She was just numb. It was all so surreal. She turned in a circle. There was the hot dog stand. Her neighbour. Then nothing. Her booth didn't suddenly reappear. No! Her purse, the keys to her pickup. Had they stolen the truck too? Would they give her back her paintings if she let them have the pickup? She had to find out who they were. Someone had to have seen something. She went to the booth on her left and pushed to the front of the line.
I'm sorry. It's an emergency. Did you see anyone taking my stuff?
The Jimmy Buffett lookalike nodded while counting out change into a woman's hand. Red truck, 3 guys, loaded you up in like 3 minutes flat. I thought they were your guys.
Red truck?
He waved her aside so the next in line could step up. Yep, a new Chevy, I think. In and out before anyone had a chance to complain. She felt like the Grinch had just cleaned her out and left a little piece of wire hanging on her wall. Only there weren't any walls. No canopy either. Only, in her little story, she doubted the Grinch was going to have a sudden change of heart and bring her life back to her. So she'd have to go after him. She stepped back in the space that used to be her booth. It was the only place that felt like hers at the moment, and she needed to make a plan. First, she was going to find a cop, and with help, she was going to hunt down a rich woman with long red nails, and a guy with a mohawk and a kilt. She decided to just take a moment to pray for help, and sank down on her knees toward the little patch of colourless grass. If only she'd sat on it earlier, none of this would have happened. Chapter 7. Dougal hurried back toward the heart of the festival as quickly as his mortal legs could carry him. With that wicked woman about, there was no telling how she might vex Miss Hannah if she were to stumble across her. Everything had happened so quickly, indeed. He'd had no choice but to act quickly. There hadn't been time to consult the lass. He only hoped she could forgive him. He found the end of the row and joined the river of attendees flowing slowly past the stalls. He stepped into the empty space where the lass had tried to part with her precious artwork and found her crumpling to the ground in a balloon of yellow skirts. In a trice, he'd scooped her up into his arms. She resisted until she saw his face. Miss Hannah. She was close to tears, or absolutely furious. It was difficult to tell which. In either case, he'd frightened her, and he might never win her forgiveness. Hannah, listen closely. Your paintings are safe, lass. We've but packed them into a truck and removed them from that woman's reach, aye. She was gathering a wee army to trick ye, so I had to act swiftly. I told ye I'd think of something, did I not? He shook her a little, and was pleased when her forehead furrowed into a frown. At least she was listening. All is well, lass. I'm right sorry for your fright, but bringing a truck onto the property wasn't allowed. With the aid of 2 fellows, we emptied the place before we caused much trouble. She blinked a few times.
You can put me down now.
He lowered her feet to the ground, made certain she could hold her own, then stepped back. I hope you can forgive me for frightening you so. She nodded.
I won't believe it until I see them.
He winced. Okay, your children are safe. I should have known better, lass. I wasn't thinking of anything but saving them from our child-eater. The blame lies at my own feet for frightening you so. She reached out and absently patted his chest, her face still bloodless. He caught her again, only this time, when he scooped her into his arms, her eyes were closed. She woke in a domed tent big enough for about 3 people. The music was much mellower than it had been all day, but still, her head pulsed along with the beat. She was glad the residents of Mendon weren't going to be harassed by the loud music that had played so late the night before. But whose tent was she in? The tent wall glowed red from the torchlights and floodlights set up around the festival. Someone passed by and blocked out the light for a second. The footsteps crushing the stiff stubble of the field kept moving. She remembered finding her booth stripped, remembered Dougal coming back and telling her that everything was safe. But where was Dougal? She looked for the door to the tent and noticed a dark, familiar shape to her right. Though she couldn't see the face of it, she knew it had to be her witch's mist. Even her left brain jumped for joy. Fresh tears were still wetting her face when someone unzipped the tent and Dougal's grinning face appeared. Even in the darkness, she would know that smile. "I see the two of ye have been reacquainted."
We have. I can't thank you enough.
He shrugged like it was nothing. "The child-eater and her henchmen are gone, lass. Hand the painting out to me and join me beneath the starry heaven. Aye, you'll find your purse next to the pillow there." Half an hour later, her paintings, tent and ladder had been transferred from the back of a new cherry-red truck into the back of her grandpa's old pickup and camper shell. The old brown and yellow paint had all but worn off, and it looked lackluster next to every other car parked in the field across from the portables, but it held the most precious cargo. Watching from a safe distance, they watched Red Nails pay off 3 different people before she and her driver gave up and drove away. There was no longer anyone she needed to avoid, but there wasn't any excuse to stay either. In fact, if she left right away, she could be home soon after midnight. The dreadlock kid locked his pretty truck and went back to the party. She and Dougal were left with an awkward silence between them. She hopped up on her tailgate and looked up into the stars. He did the same.
I wanted to thank you again. You know, for everything.
His head shook and his mohawk wobbled. "I didna do much, lass." He leaned forward with his hands on the edge of the tailgate and watched his feet swing. "I wish I might have done something more substantial to aid ye."
Well, you kept my paintings from falling into the wrong hands. For me, that's pretty major.
"I suppose you'll go now." She nodded, then looked up at the stars again.
It will take an hour to get home. What about you?
"Oh, I might have another day or so before my bride will come for me."
Are you here with friends or a band?
"Nay, lass, I know no one but the 2 fellows I invited to help us this eve. I was delivered here until my ride comes."
Where are you staying?
"Staying?" He frowned, and his face looked purple in the blue of the starlight.
You know, sleeping. You said that was someone else's tent.
"Och, I'll find shelter, lass." He waved toward the dark mountain that rose up behind the length of Mendon. "No worries there." He would find shelter. Was that a hint? If so, she wasn't going to take it. She wasn't looking for some hookup.
And tomorrow?
He shrugged and watched his feet again. "I will put a fine point on it, lass." He reached over and covered the back of her hand with his. "I believe we 2 have crossed paths for a reason, and I hope I can be of further use to ye if you'll not run from me." When a guy uses words like "don't run away," it's a cue that she should have started running a long time ago. But something freaky was going on where his hand touched hers. If she believed in such things, she would say there were little electrical impulses trying to fuse them together. It was probably just the fact that his palm was incredibly warm and the back of her hand was cool. However, for a second or two, the connection soothed her paranoia, and she heard her own voice suggest something ludicrous like,
Maybe you should come home with me.
He nodded, serious as a heart attack. "I believe that would be wise." She'd half expected him to gloat or start beating his chest, but he kept a straight face while he stood and took her hand to help her off the tailgate.
Shut up,
she said to the voices in her head. This was one matter she was going to handle all on her own. Chapter 8. Hannah would never be able to forgive herself if this ended up being a repeat of the whole ski bum episode. Every time she glanced at her passenger, she kicked herself. All the signs were there. He had nowhere to crash for a couple of days. He was handsome, charming, a little too mystic, a little too flattering. And she was about to escort him right into the heart of her life. But hopefully, this time, her actual heart was safe. If she was smart, she'd turn the truck around and take him back to Mendon, drop him off, and pretend she'd never spoken to him in the first place. But, like usual, she was indecisive, and she'd already driven most of the way home. Too late to turn back, wasn't it? Besides, didn't she owe him a little something for getting her away from that crazy woman? Another mile rolled onto her while she wavered. In her paranoid state, everything he said made her suspicious. Small talk about her town, her house, the fact that she was single, all reminded her too much of the ski bum who had robbed her blind. He promised to build her some canvas frames, but what might it end up costing her in the end? She couldn't believe she'd taken the bait, but who could have resisted such bait? A hot guy in a kilt, it would be a memory she would never be rid of. She just hoped the memory would be a positive one. Worst case scenario, she would end up calling him the Mendon bum, and hope his name would slip her mind along with anything he ended up stealing from her. Then again, she was out of money, so it wasn't like the Scot could steal much, and he absolutely would not be stealing her heart, kilt or no kilt. Flashing green eyes and sexy accent aside, she wasn't stupid enough to fall for some guy who would walk out of her life in a day or two, after fate revealed why she'd thrown them together in the first place. If she was absolutely honest, she would admit that she'd had the same feeling that something had brought them together intentionally, but it had less to do with him saving Witch's Mist and more to do with the dream that had inspired the painting. She only wished she remembered more details of the young witch in black who'd invited Hannah to paint her picture. The witch with the Scottish accent. She'd completely forgotten. Maybe his own accent could jog her memory. She just needed him to speak.
You're going back to Scotland, did you say?
Aye. She was going to need a heck of a lot more than that.
And this Sony chick, your ride, is going to be able to come get you on Monday?
Aye, or sooner.
She doesn't mind coming as far as Liberty. I mean, I can take you somewhere else if that would be easier.
Nay, lass, she willna mind, and I've made a promise, haven't I, to build some frames for your canvas. You should relax and take a man at his word. Well, this man at least. She nodded, smiled, and blushed when he smiled back.
Well, I hope you'll understand when I insist that you sleep in the work shed.
He frowned and shook his head. A single lass like yourself, living on her own, I wouldn't have expected anything else. She sucked in a deep breath and let it out in a rush, relieved. She thought he was actually going to argue with her, and now she could relax even more, knowing they wouldn't need to have that conversation while standing toe-to-toe at her front door, with every fibre of her being screaming at her to drag him inside and kiss him silly. For the next 5 minutes, she thought it wise to bite her tongue. Tell me about this house of yours, the one for which you owe taxes.
It's yellow, it's mine, and it will break my heart if I lose it. Nearly as much as it would break my heart to part with my paintings.
He gave her a sympathetic smile. 'Tis more than just a house, then. She nodded.
Much more. You'll see.
Neither of them spoke much for the rest of the hour-long ride. She tried to keep her mind on the road and her eyes open. He played with the radio. He also played with the window, even though it had an old-fashioned crank handle. In fact, there was nothing electric at all in the old pickup. The radio was all knobs, which made it more interesting to him, she guessed, because he spent so much time figuring them out. In Scotland, he probably hadn't had to physically roll down a window or tune in a station in his entire life. She wasn't surprised when he offered to drive, considering how closely he'd watched her muscle a tall gear shift in and out of gears. No doubt he wanted to see what it was like driving an old-fashioned clutch too.
I don't think that's a good idea. Driving on the opposite side of the road would take some getting used to, and it's probably not smart to learn in the dark.
Okay, you're right, of course. I'm not used to being up and about during the day, else I would have thought of that myself. She looked sideways at him.
What do you do for a living if you're not up during the day?
He mumbled something about ghosts, and she laughed.
Did you say ghosts?
Aye, lass. When he didn't say more, she couldn't leave it alone.
Come on, you can tell me. I promise not to laugh. I mean, who am I to scoff at how anyone makes a living? At least you make a living, right? Apparently, I've just been painting all this time for my own enjoyment.
She laughed to keep from crying and hoped her smile would camouflage her wildly swinging emotions. It had been an educational day. All right, lass, I'll tell ye that for as long as I can remember, I've spent my time on a certain battlefield in Scotland, Culloden Moor to be exact. He said it like she should recognise the name, but she didn't.
Sorry, never heard of it.
He shrugged and turned his attention back to the road. She did too.
So, you do ghost tours then? I mean, if you're doing it at night.
Aye, lass, steady on. For years I've walked among the ghosts of the Highlanders.
And have you seen any?
She looked back and forth between the road and his face, hoping she could tell if he was honest when he answered. Have I seen any ghosts? He laughed to himself and smiled out his side window for a few seconds, like he was remembering something funny. Aye, lassie, I've seen more ghosts than most ghosts. They laughed together at the joke, and she felt something bubbling up in her chest that she hadn't felt since that first week she'd spent with Alex, before he'd become the bum that conned his way into her heart, house and bank accounts. But she was enjoying herself too much to let that dark cloud rain on her. She didn't often spend much time with other humans as dedicated as she was to her work, so she would do her best to be present and attentive to this guy who had literally come to her rescue. There was no reason to assume things would turn out badly, and even though she wouldn't hold her breath, the guy genuinely wanted to help her. And there was nothing wrong with hope. The festival vendor life aside, delusional beat depressed any day. Optimism and even false hope weren't bad stages to be in. She just prayed his ride would come collect him before she reached the stages of disgusted or cruel hope. But even worse would be the grateful for anything and screw it stages. Obviously, she needed to get out of the festival life. She tried to drum up conversation to quiet her mind.
So, you've seen a lot of ghosts. What kind of ghosts?
Soldiers, mostly. Scots from the Highlands who perished in the Battle of Culloden. 'Twas more of a massacre in truth, so there were many souls who found the need to haunt the place, aye.
That's so sad. I'm sorry.
Thank you, lass. I'll pass on your sympathies if I ever return to the Moor. I'm sure the lads would be moved to hear it.
The lads? You mean your ghosts?
He nodded and looked out the side window again, hiding his face from her.
Does that mean you're not going to be a tour guide anymore?
He spoke to the window. Aye, lass. I hope to walk in the light on a regular basis, so to speak. No wonder the guy had no problems claiming he'd seen witches' mist before. He'd been living in the world of the paranormal. She could think of dozens of questions she wanted to ask, but he didn't seem in the mood to talk about his experiences, so she left him alone. Maybe it was the mention of this massacre that had done it, but he was no longer an extrovert. Hannah didn't know anyone her own age who got caught up in history, at least not enough to feel strongly about something that happened hundreds of years ago. A mile or so later, he turned and gave her a smile. "Forgive me, lass. I was lost in the past, aye."
No problem.
"I suppose you've questions." She shrugged.
That's okay. We can talk about something more cheerful if you want.
"Nay, lass, I don't mind. What do you wish to ken?"
Well, I guess I'd like to know why you did it. Was the money good, or were you trying to help your lads move on?
He made an exasperated noise and shifted around to face her. "Tell me, lass, why is it everyone is so anxious to make spirits move on? No one kens what's waiting on the other side of death for any of us, so why are mortals so sure that moving on will be best for anyone?" Unsure of how to answer, she bit her lips together. The last thing she wanted to do was insult him. Finally, she shrugged.
It's just an automatic response, I guess. Something we see in the movies, maybe. Or the fact that we hope so badly that there is a heaven waiting for everyone, that the bad guys will be punished and the good people will be rewarded. It's just faith.
He gave her a curt nod, then faced forward again. "Faith," he murmured. "Fair enough. Faith I can understand. I once had faith in Bonnie Prince Charlie, misplaced as 'twas."
Okay, that's a name I've heard before. I'm sure I have.
He gave a little nod and turned away again. Her lack of Scottish celebrity trivia hadn't impressed him at all. For a long time, they sat in silence. When she turned off at the sign for Liberty, he perked right up and she shared his excitement. He was anxious to see her house, he'd said, but not nearly as anxious as she was. After all, she didn't know how many more times she'd be going home to it. Chapter 9. The yellow house was charm personified. As soon as the lass turned off the main road, the grand home stood straight ahead and grew larger as they neared. The picturesque facade was lit by strands of clear glass bulbs strung along the roof and 2 tiers of balconies. The scene could only look more complete if a large party were taking place on the wide lawns to either side of the drive. As they neared, Dougal noticed the wink and shine of white paint on the banisters and scalloped trim, so fresh and new as to appear wet. The gingerbreading was equally as white. The spokes and patterns made the embellishments look like sections of a paper snowflake, quartered and tucked into every corner. An intricate fan-shaped piece filled an opening in the pitch of the highest roof. He hoped in the morning he might have the chance to examine the woodwork more closely. "Nay, lass," he said, "this is not just a house." She grinned at him and his chest swelled, simply because he'd pleased her.
I put the lights up for Christmas 2 years ago, but after the holidays I just couldn't bring myself to take them down again. The timer must be off, though. They're not supposed to be on. My electric bill will be painful.
Her smile fled, and she frowned at the front step where a dark figure got to its feet.
Oh, great.
Dougal's gut clenched, and the muscles in his thighs flexed with the need to escape the vehicle. Whatever dread this character brought to the lass's doorstep, he was glad she hadn't come home to face it alone. "Will this be my test, sonny?"
Relax. He's a friend. Kind of.
Ah, well, he'd see about that. For what kind of friend would skulk around in the wee hours? Hannah groaned inwardly, knowing that a visit from Donny, her stalker, meant she wasn't going to get to sleep anytime soon. Donny Hatch was a deputy sheriff for Weber County, assigned to the east side of the mountains, which included Liberty, Eden, and the area around the Wolf Creek Resort. He'd grown up in Liberty, and for 10 years, while Hannah and her mother had lived with her paternal grandparents, she and Donny had gone to school together. Through the end of elementary school, all 3 years of junior high, and 2 years of high school, Donny had always started her from a few spaces over in her yearbooks. During a strange pity phase in her life, she'd taken him to a Sadie Hawkins dance, Girl's Choice, and he'd been looking at her all moon-eyed ever since. She tried to tell him she invited him only because she knew he wouldn't embarrass her. He'd taken it as a written-in-blood contract to love him forever. Only after she and her mother had moved to Boise for a while did he finally give up on her. Eventually he married. The poor guy had been a little confused when she'd come back to town. Like, once she'd broken that blood contract, she wasn't allowed to return to the scene of the crime. After an uncomfortable year of running into each other at the little store in town, they'd come to a grown-up understanding. She was going to be a grown-up, and he was going to understand. All she really saw of him now was when he stopped by to let her know when her cousin was up to something. Her cousin Connie, whom she liked to call Godzilla, had to be up to something serious if Donny was willing to sit on her porch until after midnight to tell her about it. She drove around the side of the house, waved to Donny, then parked the old pickup onto the carport attached to the work shed. She jumped out and opened the back before he caught up.
Hey, Donny, you want to help us carry these into the house?
Donny stopped short. Us? Dougal stepped out of the shadows. Dougal Cameron, at your service. He extended a hand, but Donny didn't take it. Instead, he frowned at her. Where did you find him?
Mendon.
She looked Dougal over and realised what Donny had to be thinking and chuckled. She pulled out 2 paintings and pressed them against the deputy until he took his hand off his gun belt and took them.
Take these through the front door,
she told him. Then she turned and pulled Witch's Mist out next and set it in Dougal's waiting arms. He frowned at her, then nodded slightly at Donny. She shook her head just as slightly, and he turned away. She grabbed a box of smaller pieces and followed the boys around to the front of the house, watching them dance around each other, forced to play nice while they carried her precious cargo. Donny stood aside while she lugged her box up the wide steps. You sure you don't want these in your studio? She set the box on the ground while she unlocked the door.
Nope, they belong in here now, and I don't want you taking them in the back door because there are too many things you might bump them on.
Dougal hung back to let Donny go ahead of him. Donny did the same.
What is this, a gentleman contest? Just bring them inside, boys. There are still plenty to unload. You can leave the tent in the pickup.
Donny rushed up the steps first, like he'd decided it was a race, not a standoff. Dougal swaggered up the steps, like whatever the contest, he was sure he'd already won it. After a long look at his kilt in the warm light of the sconces in the entryway, she thought he probably had too. She took the paintings from Donny and set them on the hearth. He headed for the door again, but turned back when Dougal went out ahead of him. Mendon? He didn't bother whispering. You mean the Mountain Music Festival? She grinned.
Yes, Donny, that's where I met him.
Hannah, really? His hands went to his hips.
Donny, really? I need those paintings brought in before I can go to bed, and I'm exhausted.
Bed? She glowered at him.
Would you stop yelling? I'm not going to bed with him. I'm just going to bed. He's going to sleep out on the work shed.
Donny took his hands off his hips, but pouted. She rolled her eyes.
It's all right, Danny. He doesn't ski.
The shame he tried to hide as he went out the door told her he knew exactly what she'd meant. After all, it had been Donny who had taken her statement after the ski bum robbed her blind. Chapter 10. Donny made her tired. Dougal and those bare knees kept her alert. She was a mess. According to her grandma, the best remedy for moments like that was a nice cup of tea, so she made 3. The men sat at the long ends of the table and pretended not to notice each other, while at the same time each sensed every twitch the other man made. Hannah turned all her attention to the tiny swirl of steam escaping from her cup into the kitchen rafters, and pretended the house wasn't 80 degrees. The air conditioner had some catching up to do. "I can't believe you went to the music festival," Donny grumbled, "especially on a day like today." She raised her eyebrows and gave him a warning look, but he ignored it.
I went because I'm trying to make money to pay the taxes. That's how I sell my art, remember?
Then she frowned.
What do you mean on a day like today?
He sighed dramatically. "The council met today, Hannah." She shook her head. It couldn't be true.
They weren't going to meet until after the holiday. They said...
They decided the 4th of July wasn't an important enough holiday to reschedule for, I guess. They posted notices all over town. Special council meeting on Saturday.
All over town? You mean where she knew I would never see them?
Dougal cleared his throat. "I'm certain it's not my business to ask, but who is she?"
My cousin, Zilla.
Donny snorted.
Her name isn't Zilla. I just call her Godzilla sometimes. She wrecks my life whenever she can, like it's nothing more than a miniature Tokyo. And she's on the city council. It's complicated, but I asked for a continuance of my greenbelt status, so my taxes wouldn't change for another year.
She turned to Donny.
Which I'm sure they refused to do, if Zilla was there for the vote. If they'd have waited until next month, like they were supposed to, she would have been on vacation.
She slammed her hand on the table hard. The sting felt good. She only wished she could have hit something else. Yeah, they voted it down. Donny's hand reached out to touch hers, and she sat back and stretched so she had an excuse to pull her hand away with her.
Why? Would it have killed them to stand up to her?
Well, they kinda did. They gave you until the end of October to pay. Connie thought you should only have until the end of July, but it kinda looked bad for her when it came out that her husband's bank now holds the mortgage.
What?
Donny nodded. It will be pretty easy for her to get the house now, if she wanted it. Of course Zilla wanted the house, and it sounded like she already owned a portion of it. Hannah let her frustration go with a drawn-out sigh and tried to be grateful she could have another 3 months to enjoy her home before they kicked her out on her butt. Her grandma would roll over in her grave if she knew how her good intentions had gone awry. But there was no way the old woman could have predicted how nature would conspire to ruin the farm, how gullible Hannah would be where a certain ski bum was concerned, or how vengeful Connie would become.
I think Zilla's been planning this for a long time.
Donny ducked his head and tested his tea. Looks like. So, Dougal interrupted, am I to understand that you might have afforded the tax bill if the petition would have been accepted? She smiled and shook her head.
Not exactly. I still would have needed a miracle, just a smaller one. Selling a lot of paintings might have saved me, but not now. Zilla is just too clever for me.
There is something strange about defeat. Something that happens to the losers when the game buzzer sounds. Along with the disappointment comes a flood of relief, like being held under water, and then finally allowed to come up and breathe again. It was so profound a weight lifting off Hannah's shoulders at that moment, she almost felt guilty. But the emotional moment wasn't something she felt like sharing with anyone, so she rose and took her teacup to the sink, rinsed it out and headed for the hallway.
Thanks for letting me know, Donnie. Sorry I kept you waiting so long. And Dougal, there is a key there by the back door on a blue string. It will get you into the work shed. There is a small room off to the left with a comfortable couch inside. It stays cool in there. See you in the morning.
She forced a little smile and went to the living room. Silently, she bid her children good night, pleased they were safely inside the house with her. When she took them in at night in a month or two, they would be somewhere else. Chapter 11. Dougal sipped his tea and made no move to leave, knowing how nervous he made the other man. Donnie, she'd called him, like they were chums. It was clear the man was far too interested in the lass in spite of the wedding ring upon his finger, and it was equally obvious Miss Hannah Garr was not interested in comfort from him, friend or no. When he'd reached out to her, she'd all but recoiled from his touch, and it gave Dougal a measure of pleasure to torture the man for simply bothering his lass. His lass. Aye, if she had truly been his, he would have picked up Donnie by the seat of his pants and hurled him out the front door and down the steps just as soon as he'd shared his bit of news. A man of the law? No matter. If Dougal had done anything to rile the man, if he'd broken the law in some way, it would be great fun to have Donnie toss him in jail. After another day, his prisoner would have escaped, into thin air, no less. He chuckled at the thought. What a befuddled look the man would wear, what grief he would experience at the hands of his superiors. It was almost a pity Dougal wasn't at leisure to make such a thing happen, for he would enjoy telling the lads about it when he... But he wouldn't be returning home again to the Moor, would he? Another day would surely be granted him, now that he knew the lass's troubles ran deeper than before. A miracle she'd hoped for. It was clear that he himself was meant to be that miracle. But all he'd managed to do for Miss Hannah was to get her painting away from the very woman who would pay the most for it. Had he botched it? Had his duty been to make certain the woman became more interested in Witch's Mist simply because he was admiring it himself? If so, he'd accomplished that task, and the woman herself had caused the price to rise, child-eater that she was. Should he have stepped back and allowed her to purchase it? If he hadn't claimed to have already done so, would the lass have seen the wisdom in sacrificing one of her children in order to keep the home she so dearly loved? Would that Sonny was there to lend some light to the matter? "Who are you? Where are you from?" Donnie demanded. The officer, it seemed, was finished with waiting. Dougal winked at the man and took a slow sip, then gently lowered his cup and placed it just so in the centre of the saucer. He was tempted to push the man past reason, but he couldn't help the lass from inside of a dungeon. "Dougal Cameron, as I said before, and I hail from Scotland, as you may have surmised. What were you doing in Mendon?" "Listening to the pipes and drums, but I doubt you wish to ken that. What ye truly wish to know is what I am doing in Liberty, so I'll tell ye." Dougal pushed aside the tea, rose to his feet, and put his hands to his hips before glowering down at the man. "I mean to stay close by the lass, and protect her." "From?" "From child-eaters of all sorts, from relatives with wicked intentions, and supposed friends with the same." The officer stood and put his chin in the air. "I'm here to protect her too." Dougal smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. "Nay, laddie, we both ken why you're here, and there's nothing honourable about it. I suggest ye be on your way and never look back. If ye have a message for the lass, best ye write it in a letter, or send someone else to tell her. If I catch so much as your scent, and have an excellent nose, mind, it will make no matter if you're an officer of the law or no. You'll rue the day ye tasted me." The man's hand moved to his weapon. Dougal tilted his head to see it clearly, then raised a single brow. For a long moment, Donny considered his options. Eventually, he found wisdom and lowered his hand to his side and swaggered to the back door. He opened it and gestured for Dougal to go before him. "Nay," he said, "I've yet to make certain the house is locked up tight. Wouldn't want some nefarious intruder creeping into what's the last sleep now, would I?" The man winced. Dougal might have missed the reaction had he not been watching closely, but there was no question, especially after the man's face flushed a deep scarlet. Dougal leaned close. "Go," he whispered. "Go and never, ever return." The lazy speed at which the sheriff's vehicle left the drive was the only sign of the man's defiance, but defiance it was. And Dougal couldn't help but worry what would happen in a week or two when the man returned and found no sign that Dougal had ever been there. Who would protect the lass then? Did he dare tell her that the man had been sneaking in and watching her sleep, or whatever other devious activity for which he was guilty? Would she believe it? Would she be so upset that she might never trust again? He'd grown to care for her. How could he not? And he wished to do as much for her as he could before he was taken out of this mortal world again. But how could he make her happy? An untrusting, nervous life was not a happy life. But would she be any happier in a small, secure room with nothing more to comfort her than a few dozen paintings? As far as he could tell, what would make the lass happiest would be remaining in the house she loved, surrounded by whatever art made her happiest, and safe from stalkers with badges and a sense of entitlement to her. Could her needs be met by money alone? A great deal of money could ease most lives, of course, but there was little he could give her of worth. He'd promised to build frames for her canvases, but what else might he be capable of providing? He could not go before her city council and plead her case. He could not peddle her paintings by the side of the road. His fighting skills were of no help, even though he managed to temporarily intimidate her stalker. Och, but ghosting was so much simpler than real life. With his mortal brain spent with worry, it was high time he gave it rest, but he couldn't bring himself to go out to the workshed and leave the lass alone. In spite of his doubt that Donny would come back in the wee hours, at least that night, the possibility was excuse enough to remain in the house uninvited. He moved from window to window, making certain locks were in place. Then he turned off the lights and stretched out on an old and lumpy-looking couch in a room full of books. The red fabric with tiny pink rosebuds proved to be comforting indeed, as did the lumpy cushions, and he realized why she kept the unsightly thing. It felt like a mother's embrace. And the wee room was small, but not stifling, as it had a variety of windows on 3 walls. A fine place to retreat from the stress of the day and the compulsion of her art. A place he could always imagine her in, once he was gone. It was that peaceful image that escorted him off to sleep. Hannah went through her nightly ritual to help her relax, and when the worry over the house reared its ugly head, she refused to think about it. The decision had been made for her. It was all spilt milk now, and this time someone else was to blame for spilling it. Not her monkeys, not her zoo. Well, it soon wouldn't be. So she wasn't going to waste one more sleepless night searching for a solution because there wasn't one. She'd played her last card and lost the game. Time to move on. And she wasn't going to waste time worrying about the two men she'd left in the kitchen either. They were big boys. They could take care of themselves. And she was certain Dougal Cameron would make certain Donnie left the house. His nose had curled ever so slightly each time he'd looked at the deputy. He didn't like the guy any more than she did. She only wished Dougal would always be around to run the man off. She smiled when she remembered how bent out of shape Donnie had been when Dougal stepped out of the shadows. She only wished she could find a way to make Donnie mad enough to never come back. He was delusional, obviously, because he assumed she had never gotten over him just because she'd moved back to town. Like she'd arranged to inherit her grandmother's house just to be closer to him. She worried that someday his delusion was going to shatter and he wouldn't handle it well. Maybe the day his wife followed him to Hannah's house and confronted him. She spit all thoughts of Donnie into the sink with the last bit of toothpaste and washed him down the drain.
Not tonight. Not worrying about anything tonight.
She opened the window to let the cool canyon breeze inside and looked for some sign of life in the work shed, but there was no movement, no light. Either the Scot had already gone to bed or he was fumbling around looking for a light switch.
Not my problem,
She muttered, then climbed into bed and pulled the sheet over her. She was so tired she could cry. But she wouldn't waste time doing that either. Instead, she rubbed her cheek against her grandmother's smooth percale pillowcase and let sleep take her. Chapter 12. Dougal lay on his back with a wrist over his eyes. The full moon was no brighter than it had been for the past 3 centuries, but his eyes were now more sensitive to the orange glow from the far side of his eyelids. So, if he were to get any rest at all, he needed to block it out. He also needed to block out the fact that a beautiful lass lay somewhere upstairs. A lass that had not been completely immune to his charms. If he were any judge of the way her attention lingered on his broad chest and the occasional bare knee. But if he sought her out with one excuse or another, he would be no better a man than old Donnie. In fact, lingering in the house instead of haying off to the work shed was something Donnie might have done in the same situation, and the realization sickened him. He bolted off the couch and moved quietly to the kitchen, only to find that another shadowy form was moving about that night, a form that had yet to notice him. And since it might well be the armed deputy, Dougal moved silently up behind him and secured the man's arms to his sides in a great bear hug from behind, only it wasn't Donnie. It was a shapely woman, and she was no helpless damsel at that. For all his trouble, he got a headbutt to the nose that helped him recall what it had been like to be in a tavern brawl. The darkness before him erupted in bright light, white and red, like a firework going off inside his very skull. He immediately released the woman and retreated with one hand gripped across his face and the other hand out in front of him in blind defence. Electric light flooded the kitchen. The blue cabinets glared down from all around like a council sitting in judgment, and standing before him was Miss Hannah with a long, menacing butcher's knife in one hand and a heavy pan in the other. The pot rack above her head swung to and fro, announcing where she located the latter.
You.
She frowned, her expression wavering between relief and disappointment. He would like to say she was happy to see him, but she was not. He held up the empty hand, not covering his bleeding nose. "Forgive me, lass. I worried that the deputy had snuck back into the house again." She gave him a doubtful look and replaced the pan on the hook above her, but kept the knife poised between them.
If you were coming from outside, you would have come the other direction.
He inclined his head. "I sincerely beg pardon, lass. I was wrong to take a couch in the library instead. At the time I thought it prudent, but in truth it was the dishonourable thing to do."
Prudent?
She noticed the blood on his fingers, but held her ground. He supposed there was no reason to upset her in the dark of the night, so he decided not to tell her about her regular intruder. "You'd had a piece of disturbing news," he said instead. "I worried about you, is all." Her frown eased, and she nodded, then slid the knife into a block of wood on the counter behind her. "Did ye come down for a bit of tea?" She shrugged.
I
The lass was embarrassed.
walk in my sleep sometimes.
Sleepwalking he could understand. At Culloden, not a night went by that someone wasn't up and about, moving in a trance. All it takes is a little upset eye. I've known many who do the same. She pulled a cloth from a drawer and wet it in the sink, then handed it over.
I'm sorry about your nose.
He grimaced and tended to his face. "No regrets, lass. At least I ken you can defend yourself when needed, though I am sorry I startled ye." He looked at the cloth. "The bleeding's already stopped."
Would you like an ice pack?
"Nay, feels fine, lass, in truth." She took the rag from him, found a clean corner and wiped a spot on his chin. After giving his face the once-over, she ducked into the next room, and when she emerged, the cloth was gone.
I'm sure you're exhausted.
She bit her lip and let her words hang in the air between them. He got the hint. "Not at all. Too wound up to sleep, I reckon." Her smile was his reward for reading her mind. Though her hair was ruffled on one side like a hen's feathers out of place, he said nothing. But his fingers itched to comb through her pale tresses, and not only to put them in their place. She padded out of the kitchen in bare feet and bid him follow. He tried to ignore the shortness of her ruffled shorts, her long tan legs and her spice-brown shoulders, but he couldn't very well close his eyes and grope his way through the house to find her. Retracing his own steps, they turned down the hall and into the wee library with the homely but comfortable furniture. "This is where I meant to stay the night on till I came to my senses, otherwise I wouldn't have found you poking around in the kitchen." She scurried to the far end of the sofa, sat, and turned to face him.
Don't worry about it. I'm glad you're here now. If I went right back to sleep, I might go wandering again, and I hate that.
She gestured for him to sit on the sofa as well, though at the opposite end. He obeyed. "Perhaps you're not as resigned to losing the house as you supposed."
I think you're right. Never say die, right? And I kind of owe it to Zilla to thwart her if I can.
"Happy to hear it. I only wish I could summon all the money ye need to settle your tax bill. Perhaps you would care to explain what this green belt business is all about, or might it take too long to explain?" She grinned at him and lifted her brows suggestively.
That depends. How good are you at foot rubs?
His mouth hung open, but for the life of him he couldn't shut his gob. The lass was inviting him to touch her feet. It wasn't proper for his own time, sure, but in the lass's time, it was likely not considered an intimate act. After all, rich folks hired perfect strangers to massage their entire bodies, and no one so much as blinked an eye. Her eyes grew wider while he struggled for a response. His surprise embarrassed her, and he scrambled to dispel the awkwardness of the moment. "I suppose," he said, frowning seriously, "that it can't be difficult to master this foot-rubbing." Still, she was embarrassed.
That's okay. I shouldn't have suggested it.
"Nonsense." He patted his thigh. "Lift your feet up here and I'll give it a go. If I cause you pain, I'll cease immediately." She wavered for only a heartbeat more, then swung her feet up onto the couch, while pulling a light blanket off the back of the couch and across her legs, for which he was truly grateful. He no longer could pretend. His will was weak when it came to averting his eyes from any part of her. She bent one leg and left a single foot on his knee. He picked it up and placed her heel in the palm of his hand, then tentatively took hold of the end of her biggest toe. She giggled. He gave her a diabolical grin and wiggled the digit. She laughed again, but she seemed to be waiting for something more. "Start speaking, lass, and I'll start the rubbing." Chapter 13. Hannah felt horribly guilty for suggesting the Scot rub her feet. It obviously made him uncomfortable, and she suspected he'd never really done it before. When he said he was willing to try, she shouldn't have taken advantage of him, but she was just so hungry for a little human contact, she couldn't resist. It wasn't like either of them was in danger of being seduced, since they were still basically at opposite ends of the couch. But she was curious to see if there was some weird chemistry or something between them that could explain the strange feelings she'd had when he'd laid his hand over hers on the tailgate. When he'd wrapped his arms around her in the kitchen and brought her out of her sleepwalking trance, she'd been too busy grabbing for a knife and a pan to pay attention to any sizzle where their flesh had connected. But there might have been something, so she was obsessed with the idea of touching him again, or getting him to touch her, in the pursuit of science, of course. But if he was only going to touch the tip of her toes, she'd learn nothing at all, so she started talking. The logical place to start was with the death of her father. She wiggled her shoulders and snuggled into the pillow at her back.
When I was 9, my dad died.
His hands stilled. "I am sorry." She shook her head.
It was a long time ago, but that's when my mom and I moved here, with Grandma and Grandpa Gar.
He brushed the bottom of her foot, probably dusty from the walk through the house, and she laughed. "You must be ticklesome. Your foot is jumping about like a trout out of water."
I promise it'll settle down. Just rub harder.
He lifted an eyebrow at her, then wrapped his hands firmly around her foot. The heat was delicious, even in the summer heat, and she realized there had been nothing magical between them at all. It was just regular old human touch that made her feel extra alive. He started to get the hang of it. "So you've lived here since then?" She suppressed a groan of pleasure.
No. When I was a junior in high school, Mom and I moved to Boise. She died less than a year before my grandma, and my grandma left this place to me 3.5 years ago.
"And what other kin have ye?"
Just Zilla. She wasn't happy when the entire farm was left to me, but she'd already married a guy who owns a bank and half the valley. That feels so good.
She bit her lip and just enjoyed the massage for a minute. He cleared his throat to remind her she was supposed to be explaining.
I've been on my feet for 2 weeks trying to make sure I had enough artwork for the music festival. I really needed this.
"Ah, well then, I'm happy I can help in some manner, but you were saying..." "Right."
So now, Zilla and I never talk unless we run into each other. The few times I've tried to call her, she doesn't answer, doesn't return my call. I got the message a long time ago. She's not interested in family ties. But I do miss her daughter. The little girl and I might have been good friends. She's a lot like Zilla was when we were younger, before she married money. When my grandmother was still alive, it was a real working farm. I never did much more than gather eggs from the hen house, but she had a few old hands that kept things going from when Grandpa died. And there was a manager for the peach business. I've got 40 acres here. Beyond the peach orchard, the land goes straight up the mountain for a ways.
Peaches? He sounded both hungry and impressed.
Yeah, too bad you won't be around when peach days hit. Nothing better than a fresh peach from this valley.
And what do ye do with all of yours? I would think you'd make a pretty penny. Money enough for taxes, perhaps. She smiled sadly and toyed with the string ties of her shorts.
Yes, plenty of money for taxes and everything else. But 2 years ago, a virus took out the whole orchard.
She closed her eyes for a minute and refused to get emotional over the memory of it. She'd shed enough tears during the real ordeal.
I still had plenty of money from the previous crop, so I wasn't too worried. But the ranch hands retired when they got a little nest egg from Grandma's will. I'd butchered all the chickens and sold off the half-dozen head of cattle.
She heaved a mighty sigh.
And with little responsibility around here, I thought it was time I went skiing.
And skiing is a villainous thing.
Only if you bring home a ski bum and let him rob you blind.
He grimaced. Look, you didna.
Aye, laddie, I'm afraid I did. I was pretty sure I was in love, and after a week of romance, he suggested he move in with me instead of leaving town. I thought it was the only way to keep him. So I agreed. The next day, after...
She didn't want to verbalize the stupid move she'd made, so she just pointed to the ceiling and her bedroom above, hoping he'd get the picture. He nodded. He got it, but there was no judgment in his expression.
I realized I had made a huge mistake. He stopped being wonderful. He wasn't even pleasant. And after a few days of that, I would find reasons to stay away from the house. I painted, mostly. Horrible stuff. My heart wasn't in any of it.
She'd completely forgotten Dougal was rubbing her foot until he tapped her toes and gestured for the other foot. She dropped the first one on the floor, and he took the second one carefully into his hands, treating it delicately, remembering she was ticklish. No, ticklesome. And she had a feeling she would never allow anyone else to rub her feet again. So, while you were out of the house, he robbed it?
No, he never took anything from the house, just every dime out of my bank accounts. He got onto my computer, hacked into my accounts, and cleaned me out. One morning he said he was going to the store, and I never heard from him again. I was so busy being relieved, it was a couple of days before I realized what he had done. The cops couldn't do anything. He was long gone, and everything he'd told me, his name, his family, everything had been a lie.
So ye were penniless, but what does that have to do with this green belt? She sighed with the weight of her present dilemma settling on her shoulders again, and she wasn't going to worry about anything tonight.
The farm was zoned as Greenbelt, which basically means agricultural, so my taxes were 1/100th of what they would have been otherwise. But in order to remain the Greenbelt, there have to be crops or certain animals present. Farm animals. And the country sends people around to find proof you're keeping up your end of the bargain.
And your peaches and animals are gone.
Yes. After the orchard got hit, Zilla told me I wouldn't have to keep my animals if I got the place registered as an historical site. So I did. My great-great-great-grandfather Gar was the first sheriff of nearby Cache County. The house was one of the first built in Liberty. A few other things, like being the first to have electricity, helped the house qualify, so I thought my taxes would stay low.
And I take it this Zilla hasn't been truthful.
Flat out lied. Historical registries have nothing to do with taxes. and jumping through all those hoops just to keep me distracted? She was the one to sick the county on me. Suddenly, I had a tax bill that could choke a horse.
You couldn't sell part of the property in order to keep the house.
My well-meaning grandma made stipulations in her will. I got the property in the house, but the property couldn't be sold for 10 years. She probably thought that 10 years' worth of peach production would have me pretty well set, even if the taxes went up. I tried one last appeal to the county. I didn't point fingers, but I told them I'd been misled. And I made sure my petition would be addressed while Zilla and her family were out of town. With her on hand to vote it down, I didn't have a chance.
But you've decided not to go down without a fight, aye?
Right. Any suggestions?
He shrugged, tucked her second foot beneath the blanket, and sat back. What have ye of value besides your paintings, lass? She glanced around the room.
I suppose I could make a little money on a yard sale. The house is packed with antique furniture, but that won't be enough now. And you've already seen what happens when someone tries to buy my paintings.
Chapter 14. Standing in the water closet, staring at himself in the mirror for the first time in centuries, Dougal was torn by what he saw there. Even though he'd hoped to be reinstated to the same form he'd had before the battle, he was surprised to find such youth in his own face. After so many years, even though he'd lain dormant most of the time, he'd expected to appear a bit wiser. Unfortunately, other than a bit of a twinkle in his green eyes, he still looked like the young lad who'd been so passionate for the cause. Passionate, an unfortunate choice of words. He was a young buck spending the night alone in a house with an equally young and passionate doe, and his gentleman's honour was stretching a mite thin, what with the devil whispering, "What a shame it would be to have a mortal life again, and not taste the sweetness of a bonny lass's lips." He closed his eyes and breathed for a piece, trying to think of nothing but the echo of his heartbeat and that breathing as it ricocheted off the sparkling white tiles around him. In, out, lucky for the chance to prove myself, lucky for the chance to win that boon, blessed beyond measure to have 2 new days with a bonny lass. He splashed cold water on his face yet again and tried to forget that he'd had his hands on her already, albeit her pretty feet. It was enough to distract him from his purpose altogether. Even the serious nature of their conversation couldn't help when his body seemed more focused than his mind. H for hot, C for cold. Yet again he turned on the water and splashed a liberal amount on the back of his neck and his face. There, better already. Perhaps it wasn't really the power of his will that waned. Perhaps it was only the heat of the summer night, the heat a mortal body was ill-equipped to handle. He rolled his sleeves a bit higher on his arms, slipped off his boots and socks so more air could reach his skin. He was not undressing. He was not. He knew of 2 abject cowards who had taken advantage of the lass, the villainous ski-bum and the gun-toting stalker. He refused to do anything that might lump him in with that lot. He was a Cameron after all. And not just that, but a McSorley from Glenevis, and though the praise had come after he'd lost his life, his mortal enemy, the wolf himself, called his clan the bravest of them all, so resisting a morsel of temptation was the least he should expect from himself. And like the lass, he was determined to keep up the fight. Unfortunately, the temptation was going nowhere. Hannah stood in the doorway and waited for Dougal to come out of the bathroom. She didn't want to risk him heading out to the workshed without her noticing, and if she remained on that couch any longer, she might drift off to sleep, and he might decide to let her. She wanted to sleep. She just didn't want to do it alone. He was taking a long time, and he kept turning the sink on and off again. If he wanted a shower, he should have just taken one. In fact, he could have taken 2 showers in the time he'd spent playing with the sink. Finally, the door opened, and Dougal Cameron in all his kilted glory stepped into the hall and faced her. He almost looked frightened when she ambushed him.
Hey.
Hey. His eyes narrowed, like he didn't trust her.
I just wanted to stop you before you went outside.
His eyes narrowed even further. Why?
Well, it's just, I feel like...
His eyes dipped to her chest, then widened. She crossed her arms in front of her, and he looked up again. I'm not interested in doing anything stupid. He looked at the ceiling, then pointed at it. He was obviously referring to the way she'd confessed to sleeping with the ski bum. She shook her head.
No, I don't want to go upstairs, okay? I sleep alone every night, you know? And tonight, I just don't want to. If you want to sleep on the red couch, I'll sleep on the chair, okay? I mean, not that you're not...
She gestured at his body, from shoulder to knee and back again. Then she shrugged.
You know what I mean, but I'm not interested in... Well, of course I'm interested in...
Lass.
Yeah?
I'll stay, and we won't. He pointed to the ceiling again and laughed. And if you believe you can control your hands, I will try to do the same, so we can share the homely couch.
Homely.
Dougal took the lass's hand and dragged her into the wee library. The offended furniture had a fine, deep seat, and he spread himself along the back of it, then opened his arms in invitation. The lass smiled, turned her back to him, and lay down in his embrace. He regretted it immediately and turned onto his back. The lass pulled a pillow between his arm and her face, wiggled her cheek against it, then settled. Hannah, he whispered. She ignored him. Hannah, he whispered harder, but the lass said nothing. She was already asleep. Ah, lass, what am I to do with ye? And after he thought for a moment, he whispered to Sonny, just in case she might be able to hear him or know his thoughts. Whatever were you thinking, my wee witch? Chapter 15. Hannah woke in the morning more refreshed than she'd been in months. She was snuggled into the back of the rosebud couch with the lightweight throw over her. Dougal was gone. She sat up quickly and her feet caught on a pile of pillows on the floor. Apparently, the couch hadn't been as roomy as they'd hoped. She smelled eggs and melted butter and grinned. He hadn't left after all. In the kitchen, she found him standing in front of the stove with an apron over his incredibly long shirt. The kilt was missing, but he was just as covered without it. If she'd had her phone close by, she would have taken a picture before he had a chance to stop her, because that was a sight she wanted to remember for a good, long time. A gentleman cooking her breakfast. What else should she call a guy who had every chance to take advantage of her and hadn't? If he'd tried anything, she probably would have popped him in the nose again, but he hadn't known that. He noticed her. Good morning to you, lass. His gaze skimmed over her hair, and she realised she must look a mess.
Be right back.
She fled for the rear stairs and didn't go back down them until she'd brushed her hair and teeth and was dressed in clean clothes. A shower could wait until after breakfast at least, until she caught him wrinkling his nose. He was setting full plates on the table when she returned.
Thanks for staying last night,
she said, feeling suddenly shy.
It seems silly now, in the light of day, but
No need to explain, Miss Hannah.
just Hannah, thanks. I mean, we're not in the 19th century, right?
He held out her chair and grinned. Or even the 18th.
Right.
When they were both seated, he took her hand and said grace. She barely got her eyes closed before it was over.
Amen. This looks great. I'm sorry I slept through all the cooking. I could have helped do something. Maybe burn the toast for you.
He waved away her comment. I found the manual for the coffee maker. I hope it will do. She poured a cup and took a sip.
It's perfect. Thank you.
She relished the way the morning light bounced around the room. It had seemed even brighter when she'd been a child, when the cupboards had been yellow.
The smell of coffee always reminds me of my grandpa, and the sound of an old-fashioned percolator.
I imagine the man is looking down upon you now, hoping to inspire you with a solution, aye?
Wouldn't that be great?
They ate in silence for a little while before he pushed his plate away from him and leaned his elbows on the table. Now that it's light out, Hannah, and the boogeyman is back under the bed, so to speak, there is something I must tell you. Her appetite fled, and she put down her fork. After a quick sip of coffee to brace herself, she sat back and waited for the bad news, which it had to be, if he'd kept it from her last night, because it would sound even more scary to hear in the dark.
Okay, tell me.
Deputy,
Donnie.
Aye, Donny. He is no friend to ye.
He's more like a stalker, actually. It was bad in high school, but it's been even worse since I moved back to Liberty.
Then you know.
Yeah, I know.
She was so relieved there wasn't worse news. After the disappointment of the night before, she just didn't feel up to more bad news. And you've done nothing to stop it.
Well, I've been thinking about calling his wife. She knows, but she doesn't do much to stop him.
He took a hold of the outside edges of the table and gripped them like he was trying to keep the table from rising off the floor. The woman kens her husband is sneaking into another woman's house at night to watch her while she sleeps, and she does nothing.
What?
She didn't remember standing, but her voice boomed against the rafters like it had come from her toes.
He does what?
Dougal carefully released a breath and held out the chair for her again. She sat, but she didn't think she'd be able to sit for long.
Did he tell you he's been sneaking into my house?
Nay, not in so many words, but I suspected he was up to something dishonourable. I suggested he might be doing such a thing, and he didn't deny it. I told him to leave and never return, that he'll rue the day he does. But the truth is, lass, I'll be gone from here soon, either today or tomorrow, and there will be no man here to protect ye. She shook her head.
I can do it. Now that I know I can take care of it. I've got my grandpa's gun just in case, but I'll get a restraining order. I'm sure the sheriff will be interested to know why. His wife. He'll lose everything.
She shook her head.
I don't want him to lose everything. I just want him to go away.
Dougal knelt on the floor beside her chair and used a napkin to wipe away the tears she didn't realize she'd cried. He looked so utterly sweet, so silly in his apron and long shirt, but it was his bare feet that charmed her the most. It was a good thing he'd be leaving soon, wasn't it? His brow puckered. How do you feel about purchasing a dog?
I've thought about it 100 times, but then I spent 16 hours straight in the studio and worry I would neglect a pet.
He grinned. If that's your only objection, I believe you might find a fellow who could make some noise when he was hungry, aye? She nodded, more excited by the second.
And make some noise when anyone came near the house.
Just so. He resumed his seat, and she warmed their coffee. He was frowning again. And about your grandfather?
What?
What do you suppose he's trying to say to ye this morning? Do you feel any inspiration in your bones? She looked out the window at the workshed. 20-foot-high cinder-block walls, a red tin roof peeked over the large window of the upper floor. He followed her gaze. Your studio?
Upstairs. Bottom floor is the workroom. If you plan on wearing more than just a shirt today, you'd better get dressed. Because you, my fine young Scot, are going to make me those frames you promised while I paint a little. Then you can help me decide what to put in the yard sale.
He stood and turned in a circle with his hands held out. You're saying I might embarrass ye if the neighbours happen by to see a man in an apron?
You mean a man with no pants? Then yes, that's what I'm saying.
Chapter 16. For Dougal, the morning flew past like a bank of clouds hounded by a resolute wind. The workroom was filled with all manner of woodworking tools, many of them electric. A round, nasty-looking blade stuck up out of the centre of a metal table, and he could hardly wait to see how it worked, but not, perhaps, with the lassie about. The large, red button beckoned, but he was determined to wait. Hannah pointed out the pile of wood she'd been using for the frames, upon which she'd stretched her canvas. But there was another pile of all shapes and sizes, of pine, oak, walnut, that were covered in a thick layer of dust.
You can do whatever you like with that, but I would like at least a dozen frames if you don't mind.
Look, a small fee for the chance to play in such a place, lass. Ask for anything at all. She considered.
I don't know. There might be a few pieces of furniture that need a little attention before I try to sell them.
Whatever you might need, lass. He eyed the red button again.
Thank you.
He turned to face her again and bumped his lips into hers. She'd apparently risen onto her tiptoes to give him a kiss on the cheek, but he'd interrupted her. She gasped and froze. He glanced down at the lips he'd very nearly kissed, but he couldn't go after them again, not with the lass so embarrassed. So he gave her a wink and a chuckle. I hope to be better prepared the next time. She forced a laugh and fled up the stairs to her sanctuary. Next time. It hung in the air like a prayer, and he didn't care who heard that prayer, as long as they answered it. He bent his attention to the task of a dozen frames, and in but 3 hours, with the help of the clever saw in the centre of the table, he was able to make Hannah twice as many frames as she'd asked for. Many of them were larger than witches' mist, to show her he had great faith in her talent, but as he surveyed his pile of empty squares, he regretted he would not be there to see what finally became of them. To chase away his regrets, he turned to the dusty pile and invited the spirit of her grandfather to send a bit of inspiration his way, which, lo and behold, he did. After moving 6 boards from the top of the dusty pile, Dougal's mind filled with an image that outshone all others he'd been toying with. He only hoped Hannah would be half so pleased as he. A large clock on the wall proved they'd missed the nooning hour, so he tossed a tarp over the secret project and banged on the stairs. Hannah, you must eat, and so must I. He listened to the shuffling of her feet, but waited patiently, for he had too much respect for an artist's refuge to enter uninvited. Eventually she appeared with a far-off look in her eyes and a smear of spring-green paint on her chin. It so delighted him, he decided not to tell her about it. "A good morning, lass." She grinned.
Aye.
The more time Dougal spent in the company of Hannah Garr, the more determined he was to help her, and not simply because doing so would ensure his meeting the prince face to face. He simply couldn't understand what Sonny expected him to do. It wasn't possible in the current day and age for him to eliminate her stalker in an honourable duel with swords, and he couldn't pound reason into the man's head either. No doubt the fool would draw his weapon and injure innocents in the process, and nothing was worth that risk. A good dog would go far to solving the Donny problem and keep the lass from being lonely until an honourable man came along to make her his wife. The help of a couple of honourable fellows and swift action had removed Hannah and her children from the reach of that nasty woman and her henchmen. But thus far, Dougal had done nothing substantial to help the lass. She was still in just as much danger of losing her home as she'd been before he came along, and in fact, it seemed like the only danger present. This Zilla woman would have no need to harm the lass if she believed the house and property would soon be hers, and Hannah herself had proven she was no weak miss when trouble snuck up on her, from behind, even in a dark kitchen. As the pair of them sat in that same kitchen, silently eating the sandwiches she'd prepared, he couldn't help but wonder why he'd been deposited into her life. Or had he? Was there something he'd missed at the festival? Was it his attraction to the lass that had prevented him from seeing his true destiny? Was his boon lost to him? Hannah returned her sandwich to her plate, her brows drawn together.
I've worn you out, haven't I?
He smiled and felt his own forehead stretch smooth again. Nay, lass, I've just been wondering why, fate brought me to ye, if I canna find a way to change your look. She bit her bottom lip, blushed, and ducked her head. What is it, lass? What are you thinking? He ducked a knuckle under her chin and lifted it, forcing her to face him. She shrugged a shoulder, but didn't pull away.
I don't know. Maybe God thought I could really use a friend for a couple of days, that's all.
Perhaps, he said, for I am pleased to be your friend, Hannah. She glanced at his chest and arms and got a wicked glint in her eye that made him catch his breath.
Lucky for me you're a friend with muscles.
Muscles? He would rather she would find use for his lips.
Yeah, because some of the pieces up in the attic are pretty heavy.
Chapter 17. Hannah felt like a slave driver. After Dougal had worked all morning on frames, she dragged him up into the dusty attic. She had him pushing furniture around and hauling boxes down 2 flights of stairs. He carried them out to the workshed, where she planned to hold the sail, or to the garbage cans, or to the back of the truck for the second-hand store, depending on their decided fate. At the moment, he was examining a hinge on the small door of an end table, while he waited for her to decide the fate of a box of knickknacks. It didn't matter that he was happy to be of service, like he'd said a dozen times. She knew she was taking advantage of him, and she knew dang well she couldn't pay him what his time was worth. She wasn't a slave driver. She was a bully. She pushed the box off her lap and brushed her hands together.
You know what?
She climbed to her feet.
I'm calling it a day.
He frowned over his shoulder. It canna be 4 o'clock yet, love. He turned his attention back to the little door and completely missed the shock on her face. Love? Was it such a common endearment in Scotland that he didn't think twice about using it? Or had it been so long since she'd actually used the word or heard any sort of endearment she couldn't just let it go? She made her way through the mess to the one clear place to sit, an antique little bench with an odd extension off the side that helped men remove their boots.
Dougal?
Aye? He didn't turn.
When is that woman coming to get you?
You mean Sonny? He snorted. She's barely a woman, by the way. and she'll come for me as soon as I've done all I can here. Tomorrow morning, at the least, though." He looked around and found her on the bench. "Worn out, are ye?" She nodded. He wiggled the door that worked just fine now and without squeaking, and gave her a quick smile. "There is still much more I can do before the sun sets, aye?"
I was just wondering.
"Aye?" He closed the little door and finally gave her his complete attention. In 4 long strides he closed the distance, then knelt down at the end of the little extension, like he was a shoe salesman ready to measure her foot, only closer, much closer. "What do you wish of me, Hannah?" Did she dare? She had to. He'd be gone in the morning, and she'd be left with regrets.
I just wondered if you are better prepared now.
He frowned, confused.
You said that next time you hoped.
The quick but gentle press of his lips against hers cut her off before she could finish. The words "next time" had been constantly repeating in her head since he'd said them, and she realized they must have been doing the same to him. If she'd known they were going to bring such a quick and passionate response, she might have said them sooner, figured out how to work them into every conversation. Without breaking the connection, he stood and pulled her to her feet. Then he stepped over the extension and moved them both step by step until her back was against the wall. How they got there without breaking their necks was beyond her, but she wasn't about to interrupt the kiss to figure it out, not when he'd gone to so much trouble to keep their mouths together. The wall was a brilliant idea, actually. He could kiss her as hard as he wanted, without her tumbling off the back of the bench. And he did. Heaven help her how he did. Every time she got too far away from him, he'd sip at her lips until they locked again, consuming her like he believed she would be his last meal on earth. Dizzy? Yes, for 6 reasons. But one of those reasons was that she needed to take a couple of deep breaths, so she finally pushed him back a little and turned her head to the side. On the third, his mouth went after her neck, and she hissed at the flood of chills that poured over her. He paused and took a few deep breaths himself. She knew because her neck felt icy cold when the air passed over wet skin. He straightened, pulled her against his chest, and kissed the top of her head. She looked up at him and grinned, pretending she was much more together than she felt.
I think you were better prepared this time.
They chuckled together, and the awkwardness she expected never came. "What do you say, love? Now that our curiosities at least have been satisfied, shall we carry on?" She was a little too light-headed to answer responsibly, so she didn't. He made a noise in his throat that was half growl, half groan. "I am referring to the attic, lass. Shall we continue searching?" She nodded and reluctantly pulled her hands away from him. He was trying to be a gentleman, so she would try to be a lady, though it never usually took so much effort. "What are those?" He stepped back just a little so she could follow his gaze. They were standing beside an old armoire they'd already emptied, but it was far too heavy for the two of them to take downstairs. Beside it was a stack of old pictures and frames.
Those are pretty much worthless. They've been up here for as long as I can remember, and they were never good enough for my grandmother to hang anywhere. They can go straight to Goodwill.
"And the frames?" She shook her head.
You're right. I should look.
He nudged her back toward the bench. "Sit ye down. I'll hold them up and you can play, Nero. Thumbs up or down. I'll chuck the undesirables in that box."
Deal.
She was grateful to sit again. If the kiss had turned her knees to jello, the endearment turned them to water. They were useless. He dragged the entire collection out at once, then held them up one at a time, facing her. He only watched her thumb. Nope. Nope. 2 went into the box. A dog and 2 little girls, at least she thought that's what it was supposed to be, went next. The frame was the best feature, and it was little better than firewood. Another 2 followed.
I guess if the frames had been decent, they would have been rescued a long time ago.
He shrugged and held up the last. She groaned and gave it a thumbs down. It had been the stuff of nightmares. Now that she'd seen it again, the nightmares felt disturbingly recent. He tossed it into the box and brushed his hands together. At least we give it a go. The painting fell out of the box again and clattered to the floor. He picked it up and stuffed it in tight with the others. In spite of the heat, a shiver ran through her and she shook violently. "What is it?" he asked. She shook her head.
Just that painting, I guess. It's pretty gruesome. Gave me nightmares when I was a little girl.
Well then, good riddance, I say. She agreed.
You know, maybe we should burn it so that it doesn't give some other kid nightmares.
He laughed. It would be the kind thing to do, I'm sure. He removed the painting from the box and held out his hand to her. We could use a bit of cool air, I think. She blushed, assuming he was talking about their kissing and not just the dusty heat of the attic. Together, they danced down the rear stairs and rushed out the kitchen door. The cloudy day had to be at least 10 degrees cooler than the last, and she twirled around in a circle so the cool air would cool her faster. There wasn't much of a breeze, and it only tickled the very tops of the shade trees. Drunk on silliness and holding hands again, they stumbled around the workshed to the isolated area where the garbage was burned now and then. She looked in the can where the matches were kept, but there weren't any.
I'll have to get a lighter from the kitchen,
she said, and hurried back to the house. She eventually found a butane lighter in the junk drawer, tested it, and grabbed a small stack of newspaper to help get the fire started. She rounded the back corner of the workshed and stopped short when she saw Dougal was sitting on his butt, with his legs out straight, his hands gripped on either side of the nightmare painting. He looked absolutely horrified, like he'd been shot, and considering the painting, she had the fleeting, ludicrous thought that maybe someone from the painting had shot him. She started toward him, her steps heavy and slow with irrational fear, but he held up his hand to stop her. "Nay, dinna come close, lass." She took another step, and he shouted at her again. "Dinna bring your lighter anywhere near this, Hannah. I mean what I say. Go back to the house even. Wash your hands. Find plastic gloves if you have them."
What are you talking about?
For a moment he struggled to speak, holding his breath or trying to keep his emotions in check. She couldn't tell which. She wanted so badly to go to him, but she knew it would only upset him more. "Your salvation," he said, "is right here in my hands, and we must be very careful indeed."
I don't care about my stupid salvation, whatever that means. I want to know if you're all right, Dougal. Are you wounded or something?
He grinned and shook his head. Water splashed out of his eyes and onto his face. "I'm in the finest health, lass. We're both of us in fine shape indeed." Chapter 18. Hannah finally got sense out of him. The painting was priceless, or so he said, and it had scared him to know how close they'd come to burning it. She did have some latex gloves in the house, and he made her put on a pair and hold the painting while he stood and stretched a pair over his massive hands. Then he slowly carried the supposedly priceless painting into the house, like an overgrown ring-bearer. She had to spread a clean tablecloth over the table before he'd set it down, and he made her shut the curtains and block as much sunlight as she could. It wasn't possible to cover the higher windows, however, and she told him he'd just have to relax. She also had to turn off the air conditioning to keep dust from being blown around. She had to bite her tongue to keep from reminding him where the painting had been for maybe the last 50 years. She looked closely at the brushstrokes through a magnifying glass her grandma once used to read the crossword puzzle.
It looks like an original.
Aye, lass, it has to be an original. There were no copies made. It was hung in no gallery for art students to copy for practice. It was stolen soon after it was painted, and its existence denied outright.
I only took one art history class in junior college. I've never heard of this, but then again, it doesn't have a name, does it?
His grin looked a little eerie in the strange combination of suffused sunlight and 3 light bulbs hanging over their heads. Aye, it does, though not the name the artist would have wanted. This, he opened his arms to gesture to the painting as a whole. This is the butcher's butchers.
Well, it's not a very romantic name, is it?
Nay, lass, but first things first, do ye ken where your family acquired it? She shook her head and tried to ignore looking directly at the painting, afraid those images might still have some hold on her subconscious.
It's just always been here. I think my grandpa once said it was handed down from his grandma McSorley. I think those are the only Scots in the family. And she came over with a wagon train in the 1850s.
Hannah! His nostrils flared like something she'd said had excited him.
What?
Hannah, I was a McSorley.
Was?
He frowned for a second. We were part of Clan Cameron, and many of us took on the Cameron name, but I was born a McSorley.
Whoa, so we're kind of related?
He laughed. A drop or two is all. She assumed he was talking about blood.
Did they ever find out who stole the painting?
Aye, he whispered. A Jacobite spy who worked in the household of the Duke of Cumberland, the butcher himself. She plopped down into a chair and took a deep breath.
Maybe you'd better start at the beginning.
He nodded and sat too, though he pushed his chair away from the table a little bit, like he was afraid he'd lean his elbows on it.
Once upon a time, right?
He nodded. Aye, once upon a time in 1746. We'll start there for simplicity's sake.
I appreciate that.
He told her about the Jacobites, supporters of King James who wanted to put him back on the throne of England. She wasn't sure who had taken it from him, but apparently it pissed off the Scots. After nearly a year of fighting, it all ended at the Battle of Culloden, the place where he used to do ghost tours. The Duke of Cumberland put as many Highlanders to the sword as he could run to the ground. Men, women, children, all those who remained were stripped of their crops and livestock, and had their homes burned in hopes they would either starve or freeze. Did ye know, for instance, that a bill was put before Parliament to have the wives of all known Jacobites sterilised? He shook his head and looked off in the distance, saying who knows what, and the moisture in his eyes was no longer from tears of joy. Eventually he came back to her, but his voice had changed, like the passion in him had all been spent. A few years after that battle, Cumberland became the patron of a Swiss artist named David Mourier. He looked at her expectantly. She shook her head and shrugged. He commissioned one painting to depict the war between the Jacobites and the Hanoverians, supposedly.
Supposedly?
Aye. He looked around. Where is your wee tablet? Can you search for something on the internet for me?
Sure.
She found the tablet and did a search for an incident in the rebellion of 1745. She gasped when a painting popped up.
This has to have been painted by the same hand.
Aye, lass. Dougal's eyebrows were kind of stuck high on his forehead, like he couldn't quite believe it himself. And an incident in the rebellion of 1745, now part of the Royal Collection Trust, hangs in the Queen's antechamber palace of Holyrood House in Edinburgh. She swallowed hard when one word got stuck in her throat. Palace.
So what you're saying is both Queen Elizabeth and I own paintings by the same artist?
Just so, lass, just so. He pulled a corner of his plaid up to wipe his face. She would have suggested she open a door to cool them off, but he would have jumped out of his skin.
Before, you said supposedly.
Aye. He pointed to the table. This is the painting Cumberland commissioned. Her heart dropped.
So Queen Elizabeth, when she hears about it, will think it belongs to her?
Dougal laughed. Nay, lass, no one ever can claim this painting in truth, because its existence was denied by Cumberland himself.
Okay, so it's mine.
Aye, and look how close you might have come to leaving it in the attic where Zillah might have found it later. His smile returned. So I suppose I was some help to you, after all.
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna burn it, or would have sent it off to charity, but I don't understand why the guy denied it existed.
Well, look at it, love. You said yourself it gave you nightmares, and so it should, because it did too good a job depicting what happened at Culloden. She looked at it again, seeing it through Dougal's eyes. There were the same characters as the other painting, the same faces, same clothes and weapons. Even the setting looked the same, but in the butchers' most of the Scots were lying on the ground, already sporting bandages or bleeding from their legs or heads, and the redcoats standing above them were stabbing them with bayonets.
They're killing the wounded?
Dougal nodded. He didn't look right, like he might throw up.
Can I get you something? Maybe you need to go outside and get some fresh air again. It's getting pretty warm in here.
He nodded, got to his feet, then started for the door. She got up to help him, but he waved her away. He hadn't been gone 5 minutes before he was back again, like he couldn't stand to leave the painting. When he sat down again, she handed him a cold pop. He tasted it, coughed, and handed it back. No, but thank ye. He scooted closer to the table and pointed at the main character in a long red uniform. This is Battle here. He pointed to the left side where the Scots lay in agony. But this is all wrong. It should be Battle's men on the ground here. It's where they lost most of their casualties. We Camerons were the first to break ranks and attack when Bonnie Prince Charlie failed to give the order. And this is also where our lines were closest. We reached Battle's men before the artillery could cut us down. The ground was drier than the rest. We were able to perform our Highland charge here, and only here. The way he talked, she could almost believe he'd been there, on the battlefield. But she knew he was just speaking on behalf of his clan. But you see what Muir has done. He has taken the one scene of the battle that belonged to us and changed it into Cumberland's fantasy. If he believed Battle's men had truly been the victor, then the entire battle was his, and that is precisely what this is, Cumberland's fantasy.
And he hid it because it was a lie?
Dougal shook his head, and that eerie grin was back. Nay, love, he ordered Muir to paint it again, paint it over because of the truth it told. You see, even though the scene it depicts didn't happen here, the murders did happen all over the Moor. The paintings showed just what a monster Cumberland was. Faced with his own sins, he ordered them to be covered up.
But Moir couldn't do it.
Could ye have?
Absolutely not. I'd have hidden it, even if I had to wait for the other guy to die before I could show it to anyone.
I have no doubt Muir felt the same, But then the Jacobite spy found it and took it, and Murray said nothing. How could he raise a hue and cry when he told the butcher that the first painting lay beneath the surface of the second?
But Cumberland found out?
He did. Absently, Dougal picked up her hand and kissed the back of her knuckles while he grinned at the painting. It was now in the hands of the Jacobites, and rumours spread. When Cumberland heard about it, he assumed someone had seen the first painting before it was hidden, so he denied it existed, believing no one could produce it. Dougal scooted his chair to face Hannah's and took both her hands in his. And do ye ken the name of the Jacobite spy who took the painting and fled back to the Highlands?
McSorley?
He nodded. McSorley.
And it really is mine? Aye, Miss Hannah, it truly is yours.
Chapter 19. In complete shock, Hannah couldn't move. Dougal didn't have the same problem and jumped to his feet, but held on to one of Hannah's hands. The young witch from her dream walked over to the table, kicking her long black robe as she came. Though Hannah hadn't been able to remember what the girl looked like enough to paint her face, her memory cleared as soon as the girl spoke.
You're real. I am.
The girl smiled at Dougal.
You're a sight for sore eyes, Dougal Cameron.
As are ye, Sonseray. Though if you'd like to go away again, say for 50 years or more, I promise not to grieve for ye overmuch. The girl looked at Hannah and nodded.
I can see that, my friend. But a bargain is a bargain, aye? Is this Sonny?
The girl winked. Dougal did the introductions. Though it seems you've seen my wee witch before. Hannah nodded.
In a dream. Her mist was green. Like you said, but I liked blue better.
To the girl, she said,
You knew about this painting in the attic?
The witch nodded, but didn't look the least bit repentant.
Then why didn't you tell me? Even in the dream you could have told me. That was 6 months ago. You could have saved me. From meeting Dougal, you mean?
Hannah shook her head fast.
No, I wouldn't have wanted that.
Sonny nodded.
I thought not. And besides, I'm not allowed to interfere with the natural order of things. Excepting for my lads, of course. Your lads?
Where had she heard that before? When Dougal had been talking about the ghosts on the battlefield.
What do you mean, your lads?
She held tight to Dougal's hand and hoped the girl would have a great explanation that wouldn't include him.
Highlanders who haunt Culloden Moor. I see Dougal is not explained why he has come then.
Hannah braced herself and faced him.
You're just a tour guide, right? Or you were?
Aye, lass, I'm no longer. For now that I've helped you with her dilemma, I must, move on. Her hand went cold, even though his was warm as ever. They talked about moving on before too, in the truck, about mortals always wanting to help ghosts move on. She dropped his hand and stepped back.
You can't be.
Sonny stepped closer.
Nay, lass. He's no ghost at the moment. But it won't be long now. So you must say what you wish to say. Do what you must do while you can still feel each other, aye?
Hannah shook her head at him.
What is she saying?
He sighed and rolled his eyes. She's saying, if you want to kiss me goodbye, Hannah, you must hurry. She decided she would just have to fall apart later. She was not going to add any more regrets to her life, ever. So she jumped into his open arms and kissed him for all she was worth. There was no time to doubt. There was a witch standing in her kitchen, insisting Dougal was a ghost. If she believed the first, she had to believe the second, even though it broke her heart. He put as much passion into that kiss as he had the last, and she chided herself for not questioning him before, when he'd been so passionate about the battle he'd been describing. Of course he'd been there. He knew the face of Barrel, because he'd seen it in real life. She'd forgotten to breathe again, and felt the dizziness creep up on her. She broke the kiss and gulped some fast, deep breaths, believing he wouldn't stop kissing her until the witch dragged him out of the house. Sonny cleared her throat.
Dougal, for pity's sake, give the lass more than just a kiss to remember you by. Have you a token of some sort?
Dougal straightened and packed her lips one last time before he opened the pouch hanging in front of his kilt and felt inside. He glanced at Sonny with a look of devastation. The witch rolled her eyes.
In the workshed, perhaps?
"Oh," he barked, "come with me." He dragged Hannah out of the kitchen, across the rear driveway and into the shed. The open door allowed in plenty of light, but it took a second or two for her eyes to adjust. She watched as he approached a tarp covering something at the base of the steps that led to her loft. The frames were propped against the wall to her left, so it couldn't be them, and whatever was under the tarp was bigger than all those put together.
What is it?
"I hope you like it, lass. It is in dire need of smoothing and sanding, but I had to put it all together for fear Sonny would arrive before I could polish it." He sucked in his lower lip, grabbed the middle of the tarp, and lifted it. Hannah stepped forward to see it better. She knew it in a heartbeat.
I'll chair.
Dougal smiled from ear to ear. "Of course it will need white paint as well, but I built it as close to the wee painting as I could. I finished it bit by bit. Each time I brought a box from the attic, I put it here by the stairs, in case I was taken away afore I could show ye." She threw herself into his arms again and squeezed just as hard as she could.
There has to be some way to keep you. Please don't go.
He set her on her feet and took a hold of her face, then furiously kissed every inch of it. "I am sorry, love. I'd like nothing more than to stay with ye and grow old with ye, and watch the paint on old share age and wear away. But I made a promise, and I will keep it. I'm a Cameron, after all."
And a McSorley,
she whispered, trying to stay brave, trying not to cry, and feeling epically. "Aye, lass, and a McSorley." Sonny stepped inside, and Dougal touched the sash of plaid over his chest and looked at her, asking some silent question.
Go ahead, Dougal. I can give you but a moment more.
He shook his head. "It would be selfish, surely. I should let her live her life as if it never been here." Hannah grabbed his hands.
What are you talking about? He wishes to give you his name.
Sonny said. She wiped a tear from her cheek.
But he will not be back, Hannah. So tell him yea or nay.
She smiled up at her handsome Highlander. There was no use deliberating. Her mind had been pushed aside, and her heart was ruling now. She nodded.
Yes.
Silently, she prayed they would wake up on the red couch again, all of it a dream. He'd be just a regular guy, mortal and staying that way, even if it meant no painting in her attic waiting to change her life. Dougal kissed her briefly, grasped her left hand in his left, then wound the long end of his sash around their entwined hands. She grinned at him while he recited something long and poetic sounding in Gaelic. The way he spoke, with his eyes searching hers and the emotion in his voice, she could almost guess what he was saying. When he fell silent again, he unwrapped their hands and kissed her tenderly. "Forgive me, lass. There are nae papers, nae licence, aye." She shrugged.
I'll change my name. When I wake up tomorrow and convince myself that all of this really happened, I'll have my name changed. But to what? McSorley or Cameron?
Mrs. Dougal Cameron, and tomorrow, when you wake, you'll have the proof of the painting, aye." She nodded. He stepped back, and she whimpered, "Hannah." She swallowed hard.
What?
"Dinna leave that painting out for Donny or Zilla to find, aye."
I won't.
He took another step back, and she thought her heart was going to explode. Inside, all her voices were screaming at her not to let go of his hands. "First thing tomorrow, love, you start looking for that dog." Love. The word was like a small metal arrow shot into her chest.
Dog. Got it.
"And friends, lass. You need to find some friends. I'll not have my wife be lonely, aye."
Friends. Okay.
He stepped back again, and she followed. He shook his head. "Where I go, lass, you canna come. At least not for a great long while." He pulled his hands from her grasp. "But I'll come back for ye when it's time, Hannah Cameron, so dinna forget my face."
Never.
Sonny stepped up and took Dougal's arm.
Perhaps you should hurry to the house, Hannah. Get your phone and I'll take your picture together.
Dougal nodded. "A grand idea." Hannah took one long look at him through a sheen of tears, then did as they suggested. Like a robot, she walked to the house, found her phone on the kitchen counter, and walked quickly back to the shed. The only thing waiting for her was oiled chair, sitting in a beam of light from the doorway. But she'd known. Without thinking, she went to the workbench, found a rough piece of sandpaper, and knelt down in front of the greatest gift anyone had ever given her. Her heart. The chair, the house, love. He'd handed them to her, insisting that her soul, her art, was not enough to sustain life. She needed heart too. Chapter 20. The wink from Sonny told Dougal there was no time for picture-taking, but sending the lass on an errand seemed the least painful way of leaving her. There would be no clinging, no greeting, just silent, stoic hearts breaking like so much glass inside a delicate frame. And she'd known. His heart was still heavy as a cannonball when his feet met the smooth cobblestones of an unfamiliar castle. A dark loch shifted beneath a grey Scottish sky on the far side of the outer wall. The distant shore was hidden in a thick mist. They might have been anywhere. Sonny stood beside him, waiting patiently. "What do we hear, lass?" She took a deep breath. When her gaze met his, anticipation and fear looked back at him.
I'll tell you the honest truth, Dougal. You're the first I've ever brought here. The first to ever come this far.
"And where is here?" Did she require something more heroic from him than leaving Hannah behind? Sonny nodded toward a towered door.
Go, Dougal, and see. And coward that I am, I shall wait here.
It bothered him to see his confident lass so nervous, but it seemed there would be no relief for her unless he did as she'd bidden. If there be some sort of dragon inside, metaphoric or otherwise, he would deal with it, so he could exact his revenge while he still had a taste for it. Thanks to Hannah, he'd nearly forgotten his purpose, but the painting had rekindled his wrath, his need for justice. If slain dragons would balance those scales again, so be it. As he neared the door, his hands moved naturally to where his weapons had once been, and he found his hands filled with the familiar hilt of sword and dagger. The weight of a small targe told him the shield was also there at his back, if he should need it. Like gifts from Greek gods. "Thank ye," he whispered to his wee witch. though she was far too distant to hear him. The tower held a spiral staircase. The steps leading up were barred by a heavy chain draped across the opening. Rust and moss in the links promised none had trespassed there for a great while, so he turned to his left and descended. The triangular steps were far too small for his long feet, so he had to step sideways. Since this exposed his vulnerable side, he swung the targe from his back and covered his left arm with it. With his right hand, he pulled his sword free and, armed lustily, he proceeded. An opening appeared, but since it opened onto a wide stone balcony overlooking the loch, he continued down another 2 full turns. Torches lit a generous room with arched ceilings. Nothing stirred but the flames. Darkened archways led off in 3 directions. More torches lit a 4th and the narrow hallway beyond. With stealthy steps he followed it for 10 feet before it turned to the right. The next walkway had a wall of stone on his left, and on his right a low handrail of wrought iron. He peered over the edge and sensed something far below. A cold shiver ran down his spine and into his stomach. He wanted to retch. He was that sickened by whatever awaited. Suddenly, a thick green mist billowed around him like smoke from a noxious fire, and though he covered his mouth with his sleeve, he had no trouble breathing. Green mist. Witch's mist. It was there to protect him. Once again, he whispered his thanks to Sonny and continued. The walkway turned to the right again. The handrail remained constant. The path sloped downward. He turned twice more until he suddenly emerged into the centre of the large 20-foot square created by the walkways. A single torch burned against the wall to his right. He braced himself for an attack by the demon or whatever monster lived there, but again nothing came. 4 iron gates lined the wall to the left with dark cells behind. Dougal faced them, sword raised. At the sound of his boot pivoting against the stone floor, something shifted in the darkness. A bonny face moved into the light. "Oh, thank heavens you've come!" Chapter 21. No amount of preparation could have readied Dougal for the sight of that face, so there was no need to blame Sonny for not warning him. No matter how many times he'd imagined this meeting, there was something undeniably shocking about coming face to face with royalty. Yes, he knew that face. It haunted the inside of the great visitor centre on the grounds of Culloden, and though few of the 79 ventured inside, Dougal had, many times. And in spite of his name and the portraits, it was still a surprise to see how bonny was bonny Prince Charlie. The centuries and the bitterness made no matter. Dougal's sword arm swept up to the side, and he bowed. "Your Majesty." The prince moved up next to the bars, his uniform no different than the glimpse Dougal had seen of it on display. He was taken aback by the size of him, not much bigger than Sonny. "And you are?" Dougal inclined his head. "Dougal Cameron of the McSorleys, Your Grace." The prince's face lightened with relief. "Of course, Clan Cameron has come to my rescue yet again. Now," he stepped back from the gate, "let us leave this place." Dougal took a step and stopped. He'd nearly forgotten his reasons for coming, and he certainly wasn't interested in freeing the prince if someone ordained his soul should be imprisoned there. But he didn't look like a spirit at all. "Beg pardon, Your Highness." The man grunted with impatience. "Can't your questions wait until we're above ground at least?" He waved at the bars before him. "Have you got a key?" The inflection to his speech surprised Dougal. Granted, the man hadn't been raised on an island in the Orkneys, but still, he expected to feel some fraction of kinship with his leader. As it was, he might as well have been Louis XV, the King of France. In any case, the sound of his accent served to dissolve any lingering intimidation. "I haven't a key, and have no intention of releasing ye." Charlie's white gloves gripped the bars. "But you must! Something is amiss, I say. My captors cannot know who I am, surely. Go to them. Tell them I cannot be left here in the darkness, abandoned like some wounded soldier on the field, with his leader fleeing before the fight is ended, left to stand in the face of artillery fire, blown to pieces because that same leader refused to give the order to charge." Charlie's nose went up in the air and the white gloves fell away. "Guard! Guard!" "What's that, Charlie? You're calling your enemy to capture your rescuer." Dougal shook his head and tisked. "Another betrayal, your highness. Know ye no shame?" He glanced over at the large hole in the floor in what looked to be a fireplace, but he knew what it was, and Charlie would know too. So he pointed. "Perhaps a little while in the oubliette might help ye repent, aye." The man shrank back even farther. "Guard! Au secours!" Slow footsteps echoed around the square, growing louder but no faster. Dougal raised his sword before him and waited. Truly, there was not much he feared. He'd agreed to move on to the next life as soon as his meeting with Charlie was over, and he'd suffered death once before. A bit of mortal pain didn't frighten him. He was no fool, however, and prepared for the worst. If Hanoverians or their spirits overran the place, it only meant a bit of sport before Sonny collected him again. Tap, tap, tap. The prince whimpered. A dark form paused at the top of the last length of walkway and peered over the rail. "You called, your highness." Scottish? English? It was difficult to say. Dougal realised his protective green mist had disappeared. He was on his own against this one. The man made his way down the ramp and into the room and nodded at Dougal. "Cameron?" "Aye." The man nodded. "Are you finished with him yet?" Dougal grinned at the prince. "Not quite. Would you like the key?" Dougal considered it, then shook his head. "All right then, I'm not far." The dark man never looked at the prisoner and strode back up the ramps. When the prince protested, he only laughed. The green mist rose and swirled around the room again, faster now, as if impatient to be gone. Dougal had no idea why it stayed, but it was a comfort. With no other alternative, Charles Stewart turned his petition to Dougal. "Cameron, please, help me. You believed in me once. You fought to put the Stewarts back on the throne where we belonged. Won't you fight for me now, Dougal scoffed. "I died for you once. Give ye my blood. I'll give ye no more." Full of bitterness, his stomach turned, and he longed to purge it from his body, from his heart. Besides, his Hannah resided there, and bitterness had no place with her. "I'm not ashamed of my loyalty," he continued, "nor my passion for the cause. I'm dead certain most of my comrades in arms, both dead and undead, still believe our cause was just. We believed the Stuart line belonged on the throne, but after so many years, watching so many soldiers fall in all manner of wars, it is my conviction that a drop of royal blood is worth no more than a drop of mine. If you'd been as keen to protect my life as I was to protect yours, perhaps you would have been more particular about the site of the battle. It would have made certain we had ground beneath our feet for the Highland charge. You wouldn't have allowed that wild goose chase the night before, when we were already cold and hungry and bone-weary. The prince had retreated to the rear of his cell. Nothing was visible but his wide eyes. But your biggest sin against all of us was to order us to turn tail and retreat from England on the word of one man. One man, damn ye! Dougal spit in the prince's direction. We died for a cause, but we also died for a fool, and I'll not waste another moment on ye. I pity ye, Charles Stewart. May God have mercy on your soul. And with that, Dougal left the prince and the dungeon behind, and as he climbed the ramps that led up out of the bowels of despair, he felt the long-borne burden of vengeance fall away from him. The green mist faded into nothing as he approached the dark man standing at the top of the walkway. The fellow was dressed in such dark clothing he might have been standing in that same spot when Dougal descended. I'm finished with him, he said. The dark man nodded. Dougal lingered. How long will you keep him here? No telling, the other man said. Many others intend to come. Dougal grinned. If ye wouldna mind, I think the prince would like to know it. It will give him much to think on while he waits, I reckon. The dark man smiled to one side. As you wish. Dougal nodded and stepped to the archway and the short hallway beyond, but a hand stopped him. You did well, Cameron. I did. Aye, your kindness to Charles Stewart will speak well for ye, I believe. He released Dougal's arm. Godspeed. His mind reeling, Dougal wandered down the hallway, through the large room of torches, and started up the spiral staircase. Had he been kind? He'd been more respectful than he'd planned to be, but that was all. And only a moment before, he'd suggested the jailer strike a bit of unkind anticipation into the prince's heart. Why did the man believe Dougal had shown the prince a kindness?
May God have mercy on your soul.
Sonny beamed at him from across a stretch of rain-soaked cobblestones, pleased with her quick wit, throwing his own words back at him. It had to have been those words and his pity that may have seemed kind, but it no longer signified. It only mattered that it was over. When he reached her side, Sonny's cheeks were as wet as the cobblestones, but he doubted it was from the fine Scottish weather.
You've done well, my friend,
she said, then rose on her toes to kiss his cheek. Judging from the brilliant globe of light hovering near the outer wall, he assumed that was the last kiss he would ever feel against his mortal cheek.
'Tis time, Dougal Cameron. You've a fine, brave soul, and it is high time you were rewarded for it, aye?
And Hannah? Sonny tisked.
Hannah has a great many lives to bliss before she's through, Dougal. Dinna be selfish.
But I will see her again. He tried to sound confident. The lass shrugged.
What am I? A fortune teller?
But her wink told him she was just that, and a mind-reader, a dream-walker, and the saviour of Culloden's 79. He bent and kissed her forehead, gave her hands a squeeze, and bid the lass a fare thee well. Then, with no burdens left to bear, he turned toward the outer wall. The clouds scuttled away, and the day grew lighter with each tentative step, until such brightness could not be attributed to the natural sun. Even so, he had no need to hesitate, and stepped fully into the brightness that awaited him. This has been Dougal, The Ghost of Culloden Moor, Book 12, written by L. Muir. Narrated by Andrew McDermott and Jenn McGuirk. Copyright 2015 by Leslie Muir Lytle. Production copyright by Leslie Muir Lytle. Epilogue. An old woman of 87 years lay eerily still in the bedsheet known for nearly as long. Her fingertips passed lightly back and forth over the tiny pink rosebuds raised in the pattern of her bedspread. She so loved the tiny rosebuds. They brought to mind a dozen happy memories, but one most of all. The memory of a brawny Scottish Highlander with open arms, stretched out on a homely couch of pink rosebuds on a field of red. She still possessed a small pillow made from the awful fabric, though she suspected it now sat forgotten in the bottom of a toy chest in another room. It would have been a comfort at the moment, but she wasn't quite up to asking for it. Whoever thought pink and red went well together, except at Valentine's? She chuckled, then coughed, which brought Madeline to her side once again. Her cousin's daughter, 11 years old, tried to distract her.
Tell me again, Hannah, about the witch in the painting.
Beyond the foot of the bed, hanging above a small mantle, hung witch's mist. The Nile blue mist was woefully out of vogue, and matched nothing but her memories now. Though it clashed with the warm, sunny colours of her bedroom, she'd been determined to leave the painting where it was until the day she died. Tomorrow, she thought, someone could finally take it down.
The witch's name is Sansaray, a beautiful young Scotswoman who introduced me to the only man I ever loved. And his name was Dougal? Yes. I don't believe you.
A strange thing to say, since the girl had heard the story a dozen times.
Why? Because you named all your dogs Dougal.
Hannah laughed, coughed only once, then settled again. Her coughing upset the girl, so she did her best not to do it.
At least I never forgot his name,
she teased. Madeline wrinkled her nose, and in doing so resembled her late grandmother, Zilla.
If I fell in love with someone, I would never, ever forget his name, even if I never saw him again.
Hannah gave her a wink.
Oh, Maddie, I would never have forgotten. Then you were teasing me? Yes. But you did name all your dogs Dougal.
Hannah sighed. The urge to cough was powerful, but she wouldn't. She couldn't. She just didn't have any more to give.
Yes, I did. So I would have an excuse to say his name 20 times a day.
Maddie was still unimpressed.
What good would that do?
Hannah shrugged weakly.
I figured if I called him to me 1,000,000 times, he'd have to come back.
The little girl rolled her eyes and watched her for a moment. She pretended to fall asleep so the child could find something more exciting to do. A moment later, Maddie tiptoed from the room, but a heartbeat later, someone else entered. Hannah's eyes opened at the sound of boots on the floor. A young Highland warrior with a familiar mohawk and rumpled kilt stood beside her, with a gentle smile on his face. Hannah, lass, it's only been 500,000 times you've called my name, aye? So kiss me, and thank me for not making you wait twice as long. She pushed herself to her elbows, then sat up easily, no longer weighed down by her bag of bones. Her long, blonde hair that she'd missed for decades fell around her shoulders and tickled her cheek.
Dougal Cameron, I thought you'd never come.
He leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a long, wished-for embrace. Silly woman, he said. I've snuck into your room 1,000 times to watch you sleep, aye? Had you never sensed me? Hannah pretended to be surprised.
That was you? I thought it was Deputy Donny. You never did get over me.
Dougal grunted and took her hand. Come with me, Hannah Cameron. I'll make certain you never have room to doubt me again." She laughed against her hand, hopped down off the bed, and spurred a short but solemn glance at the old body she'd left behind. Now that her Highlander was back, she was glad for the time she'd had on this earth. The time to love and be loved by many, like Maddie and her mother before her. And now she was content to be loved by the one who had watched over her day and night for decades. Together, she and Dougal rose on swirls of pale mist toward the unknown. Somewhere below, her fragrant peach orchard waited for another day of sunshine. In a studio full of empty canvases, Madeline hid from her mother and picked up a paintbrush. On the porch, a beloved wooden chair waited for the next generation to paint it, and a broken thread needed mending. But none of it needed her, except the Scotsman holding her hand, who would never again let go.